Section 1. The Vaults. What they really were and what they really did. Settle in. Get comfortable. Pull the blanket up just a little higher, let the room go quiet around you, and let me take you somewhere strange. Somewhere that hums with fluorescent light, where the walls are thick concrete and the world above has turned to ash and static. Somewhere underground, sealed tight, full of secrets that nobody upstairs was ever supposed to know. Welcome to the Fallout universe. There are few fictional settings that exist with this kind of richness, this kind of layered sadness and dark humor all knotted together. Fallout is a world built on ruin, not just physical ruin, the collapsed buildings and irradiated craters and scorched highways, but the ruin of ideas, of promises, of a civilization that looked at itself in the mirror one morning and decided it was perfect, right up until the moment it burned itself alive. And nowhere is that contradiction more vivid, more quietly devastating than in the vaults. You probably know what a vault is if you're here. You've seen them. Those massive circular blast doors with the number stamped in steel. You've walked the yellow-lit corridors, talked to the scared, confused, or occasionally completely unhinged people living inside them. You've read the terminal entries that seem normal on the surface, then slowly shift into something deeply uncomfortable the further you scroll. The vaults are one of Fallout's most iconic images, and they are built entirely on a lie. The official story, the one printed on the brochures, the one Vault-Tec sold to panicked Americans in the years before the bombs dropped, was simple enough. The world was heading toward nuclear war. Resources were running out. Tensions between the United States and China were climbing toward something catastrophic. And Vault-Tec had the solution. Buy a spot in a vault. Stay safe underground while the surface became uninhabitable. Eventually, when the radiation cleared, emerge and rebuild civilization. Clean, rational, hopeful. None of it was true. Here's what was actually going on. And this is where the first great theory of the Fallout universe lives. Not a fan theory, but something much more interesting. The original intent behind the Vault program, as explained by Tim Kaine himself, one of the co-creators of the original Fallout games, was something that goes far beyond simple corporate greed or even government paranoia. The vaults were never built to save Americans from nuclear war. They were built to test technology for a generational starship. Sit with that for a moment. The Enclave, the shadowy continuation of the United States government, the ones in the gleaming power armor who showed up in Fallout 2 on their offshore oil rig, had already decided, long before the bombs dropped, that the Earth was essentially finished. The resource wars were coming. Nuclear exchange was a mathematical certainty at some point, and they looked at the planet they'd spent centuries exploiting and concluded there was nothing worth saving here. The plan was to leave, to build a ship, load it with the purest, most carefully selected remnants of humanity, and aim it at another star. The vaults were the testing ground for that ship. Tim Kaine explained this in a video that sent ripples through the Fallout community. Every problem a multi-generational starship would face. How do you grow food in a sealed environment? How do you manage water recycling? How do you store a crew in cryo-sleep without neurological damage? How do you maintain social order when there's no outside world, no horizon, no sky? Every single one of those problems could be modeled inside a vault. The bizarre experiments weren't random sadism, though sadism certainly played its part in the implementation. They were research. Terrible, unethical, often lethal research, but research with a coherent underlying purpose. Vault 13, the one you start in during the original Fallout game, is a perfect case study. Kaine noted that Vault 13 was designed to test how long a population could remain sealed underground without losing psychological stability. The Overseer was specifically instructed to keep residents inside for as long as possible, to delay or prevent departure, to watch what happened when the world outside stopped being a theoretical concept and became an actual memory, something fading and distant and increasingly unreal. What does community look like when there's no outside pressure? No frontier, no sense of the larger world? What happens to social hierarchy, to identity, to the stories people tell themselves about who they are? Vault City, the prosperous settlement you encounter in Fallout 2, emerged from what Tim Kaine called a control vault, one that was designed to function correctly, to give researchers a baseline, a clean experiment running in parallel with all the broken ones. And even the control vault produced a society with its own anxieties and blind spots and inherited prejudices, which tells you something quietly devastating about the experiment. Even under ideal conditions, humans rebuild the problems they started with. Now let's go deeper into specific vaults, because the variety of what Vault-Tec actually ran in those underground chambers is one of the most disturbing rabbit holes in all of gaming lore. Vault 11 is one of the most morally harrowing. The residents were told, on arrival, that one of them had to be sacrificed each year to prevent the vault's computer systems from shutting down. They were told this was mandatory. This was the condition of their survival. And so, for decades, they held elections. They chose someone to die. They built entire social systems around who would be selected, who had immunity, who was volunteering, who was being pressured. Factions formed. Corruption bloomed. Power shifted from person to person based entirely on who could guarantee their survival another year. It was a perfect model for a long space voyage under extreme resource constraint, except the sacrifice was never actually necessary. The Vault's computer only required the sacrifice if the residents agreed to it. The entire horror was optional. They could have walked away from it at any point. They just didn't, because the structure of the institution had made it feel inevitable, and questioning inevitable things is one of the hardest things humans can do. Vault 21 in New Vegas had everyone gamble for everything. Conflicts, resources, leadership, ownership, all settled by games of chance. It sounds almost charming, until you realize that gambling addiction is a real psychological phenomenon, that some people are systematically worse at probability assessment than others, and that building an entire civilization around that disparity creates a permanently stratified underclass as reliably as any other system of inherited disadvantage. The house, as they say, always wins. Vault 81 was supposed to be dedicated to medical research, specifically the development of cures for diseases. The experiment was that test subjects would be periodically exposed to various illnesses so that scientists could develop treatments. The experiment more or less fell apart because the scientists running it developed something like a conscience, or at least an inability to keep injecting people with diseases, and so Vault 81 muddled through as a more or less functional community with a very strange, slightly haunted medical wing underground. Vault 92 housed professional musicians. Specifically, it was used to research white noise experiments, subliminal messages embedded in the sounds the residents heard through headphones, and speakers designed to induce violent psychotic episodes in controlled conditions. The idea was to test methods of psychological manipulation that could be used to control soldiers. The experiment worked. Eventually, the musicians turned on each other in waves of triggered violence. The terminal entries left behind are among the most quietly disturbing pieces of writing in the entire series, full of that specific dread of people who understand something is wrong but can't quite locate the source of it. Vault 95 was entirely populated by people with pre-existing drug addictions who were provided with a clean, safe, supportive environment for 5 years, no substances, full recovery support, genuine community, and then, on a specific date determined before any of them entered, the Vault systems released a massive cache of drugs into the facility. The researchers wanted to know how long sustained recovery would hold against sudden, unlimited availability. The answer, as you can find in the scattered remains of the Vault's population when you visit it in Fallout 4, was not long. Vault 77, referenced in a comic strip that Bethesda canonized, contained exactly one man and a crate of puppets. Just one man. And the puppets. There's a particular cruelty to Vault 77 that hits differently when you sit with it. Not the cruelty of the disease experiments or the subliminal violence manipulation, but something more existentially suffocating, the cruelty of radical isolation, dressed up as a population study. What does identity look like when there's no one to reflect it back to you? The man in Vault 77 apparently gave voices to all his puppets and held elaborate conversations with them. Whether that represents a survival mechanism or a slow dissolution of self is something the record doesn't clarify. It just leaves you with the image of a man talking to puppets in a sealed room while the world burned overhead. And then there's the layer underneath even all of this. Because here's the theory that doesn't quite get talked about enough. The Enclave Starship plan never actually worked. There's no evidence anywhere in the games that the Starship was ever built, ever launched, ever came close to completion. The Enclave survived the Great War on an oil rig off the California coast, rattling around in their power armor and increasingly outdated ideology, their grand cosmic ambition quietly rotting. The Vault experiments produced mountains of data that nobody ever analyzed for their intended purpose. The sacrifice of possibly millions of Vault residents, the psychological damage, the lives cut short in controlled experiments, The communities destroyed contributed to a scientific endeavor that appears to have been abandoned before it yielded any result. This is one of Fallout's oldest and most elegant tragedies. The whole system, the vaults, the experiments, the suffering, was predicated on a plan that was already disintegrating before the bombs even dropped. The Enclave was so convinced it was managing humanity's future that it never noticed it had already lost the thread of its own purpose. Vault-Tec itself adds another layer. The corporation that built the vaults and ran the experiments was, in the show's canon, the entity that actually initiated the nuclear exchange. Not China, not some rogue military AI, not a desperate American president, a private corporation, motivated by the desire to ensure that its investment in underground infrastructure would be used, launched the first bombs, and let the rest of the world's nuclear stockpiles do what stockpiles do when they're triggered by perceived incoming fire. Vault-Tec didn't just profit from apocalypse, it manufactured one. And even that reading, the show's answer, sits uncomfortably beside Tim Kaine's original vision, which pointed to China firing first in response to American bioweapon development. Multiple truths exist simultaneously in this universe, which is perhaps the most realistic thing about it. History, especially the history of catastrophes, is never clean. The record is always incomplete. The survivors always disagree. The institutions that cause the damage always have their own self-serving narrative ready. There are 77 confirmed Vault experiments that players can learn about across all the games. That's 77 distinct social and psychological and physiological tests run on unwilling human populations. The people in those vaults thought they were surviving. They thought the Overseer was looking out for them, that the Vault-Tec materials they were given represented genuine care from a corporation that had chosen them, specifically to carry humanity forward. They were test subjects in sealed containers, and the researchers watching them were either dead by the time the experiment concluded or had moved on to other projects entirely. The vaults are what you get when you build a system of control so total and so confident in its own necessity that it forgets or simply doesn't care what the humans inside it actually need. Breathe for a second, let that settle. And now let's talk about the world those vaults were hiding from. Drop a comment letting me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is where you are. And if you're new here, consider subscribing. We do this kind of deep, slow lore exploration regularly, and there's plenty more where this came from. Section 2. The pre-war world. What America actually became. Before any of this, before the vaults, before the bombs, before the wasteland became the only world anyone alive could remember, there was a country called the United States of America, and it was absolutely convinced it was doing fine. This is one of the most important and quietly unsettling aspects of the Fallout universe, and it tends to get overshadowed by the more dramatic elements. We spend so much time talking about the bombs, the radiation, the mutants, the factions fighting over scraps of the old world, but the world before the bombs is where the real horror lives, and it's horror of a very specific, recognizable kind. Fallout's pre-war America is our world. Not literally the timeline diverged somewhere in the years following World War II, a split that left this alternate history running along a different track. The transistor was never developed in the same way. Computers stayed large and analog, banks of glowing tubes instead of silicon chips, which meant the digital revolution never happened. The internet never existed. Information never became democratized and chaotic and globally networked. Nuclear power became the backbone of all energy production, which solved some problems and created others, mostly by making the world's most powerful nations even more invested in technology that happened to double as a weapon of mass destruction. But the cultural divergence is the part that stays with you. The aesthetics of 1950s, America, the optimism, the clean lines, the bright colors, the faith in science and progress, and the essential goodness of the American project never faded. They calcified. They became the permanent aesthetic of a society that had decided it had already arrived at its best possible self, and all it needed to do was continue in the direction it was already going. The Fallout universe is a place where the Cold War never ended. China and the United States never achieved détente. The paranoia never mellowed into something manageable. The propaganda that ran hot in the early nuclear age just kept running, kept getting louder, kept becoming more total, more ambient, more impossible to see around because it was also the wallpaper, the music on the radio, the cereal boxes, the advertisements in the subway. Every aspect of public culture in pre-war America reinforced the same message. The American way of life was worth protecting at any cost. America's enemies were existential and implacable, and the individual's job was to consume, to trust the institutions, and to be afraid of the right things in the right amounts. One of the most fascinating lore details comes from the structure of the American government in the decades before the war. By 2060, the 50 states had been reorganized into 13 Commonwealth's administrative regions, with somewhat consolidated governance. This change appears calm and bureaucratic on paper, but think about what it means: a government that was reorganizing its internal structure in anticipation of something, making itself more centralized, more manageable, easier to command from the top down. The enclave, the shadow government, the people who actually held power were beginning to prepare their lifeboat while the ship was still afloat. The resource wars began in 2052. That's the pivot point, the moment when the underlying contradictions of this world's economy became impossible to paper over. Global petroleum reserves hit critical levels. The European Commonwealth and the Middle Eastern nations went to war over oil in 2052, a conflict that dragged on until the Middle East was effectively a radioactive ruin by 2060. The United Nations, which had been struggling to function for years under the weight of member nations' competing interests, officially dissolved in 2052 when it failed to mediate the oil conflict. International institutions didn't just weaken, they ceased to exist. What replaced them was pure bilateral confrontation between the two remaining superpowers. China invaded Alaska in 2066. That's the event that crystallizes everything. The United States had established the Anchorage Front Line in 2059, protecting its oil pipeline there, the last significant petroleum reserves in American territory, and China sent its army across to take it. This was an act of such naked desperation and such clear strategic logic that it's hard to assign simple moral blame to it. China was running out of resources. It needed what Alaska had. It did what powerful nations do when they want something and have enough weapons to take it. The United States responded with everything it had. The T-51 power armor, the iconic suits you see on the Fallout box art, the gleaming green and yellow giants were deployed in the Anchorage campaign, and they represented the absolute cutting edge of American military technology. Soldiers inside those suits could fight in conditions that would kill an unprotected human in minutes. They were essentially walking tanks with consciousness. The Battle of Anchorage lasted over a decade, a grinding meat processor of a conflict in sub-zero temperatures, and when the Americans finally retook the city in 2077, it was treated as a massive national triumph. Parades, broadcasts, holographic recreations available for public entertainment. What it was, in truth, was the moment China recognized it had lost the conventional military contest and began seriously contemplating the unconventional alternative. While all of this was happening on the military front, something else was occurring in the laboratories. The Pan-Immunity Virion Project, which would become the Forced Evolutionary Virus, or FEV, was being developed at Vault-Tec Research Facility in California. The original goal was something almost utopian in its ambition: create a biological agent that would make humans immune to the effects of radiation. The Cold War logic is obvious. If your soldiers can fight in irradiated environments, you have a profound strategic advantage. If your civilian population can survive nuclear exchange with less damage, your deterrence becomes more credible. What they ended up creating, as you know if you've spent any time in the Fallout universe, was something considerably more complicated than radiation immunity. The FEV rewrote its subjects. It transformed them. Given enough exposure, it turned human beings into something the games call super mutants: massive, incredibly strong, largely sterile beings of extraordinary physical durability and, depending on the strain and dose, wildly varying intelligence. The United States military was testing a supervirus capable of fundamentally altering human biology, and this is what Tim Kaine says drove China to eventually launch its nuclear strike. Not just the conventional military humiliation at Anchorage, but the discovery or credible intelligence that America was developing bioweapons capable of rewriting what it meant to be human. This context changes how you feel about the Great War when you sit with it. The bombs didn't fall because two nations were stupid and aggressive and couldn't find a peaceful resolution. They fell because the logic of competition between those nations had, over decades, produced increasingly drastic and irreversible actions, each one responding to the last, each one making the next more likely, until the system reached a point where the only remaining moves were catastrophic. The Fallout universe's Great War is a demonstration of what game theorists call defection cascade, when mutual distrust has run so hot for so long that no individual actor can afford to trust any longer, and the only rational response is to strike before you're struck. The resource wars weren't a mistake. The annexation of Canada, yes. The United States forcibly incorporated Canada into itself sometime before 2077, something the games mention only in passing, as though it's simply an administrative fact rather than an occupation, wasn't an accident. These were choices made by a system that had decided its own continuation was worth any price, that American prosperity justified any measure taken to protect it, that the interests of the American state were synonymous with the interests of humanity. And this is where Fallout becomes genuinely, uncomfortably relevant, because the pre-war world isn't a fantasy of pure evil. It's not populated by people who knew they were the villains. The ordinary Americans living in that world, the ones buying Nuka-Cola and listening to ink spots on the radio and teaching their kids to love their country and checking their mailboxes every morning for their Vault-Tec, correspondents were living in what felt like a real civilization, a real community, a real way of life worth protecting. The propaganda wasn't just imposed on them from outside. It was something they'd grown up with, something that felt like common sense, like obvious truth. The Fallout Museum of Freedom, scattered references throughout the games to pre-war media and entertainment, the cheerful corporate mascots and the patriotic comic books and the Grognak the Barbarian pulps, all of this was the texture of a society that had convinced itself its own violence was righteous, its own fear was justified, its own greed was survival, its own cruelty was strength. Sound familiar? One theory that emerges from all this is about the cultural stagnation itself. Why did 1950s aesthetics persist for over 100 years into the future? The in-universe explanation is that the transistor's absence stunted the digital revolution, which is mechanically true. But the deeper answer is ideological. A society that is simultaneously paranoid and triumphant, afraid of what's outside but convinced of its own rightness, has very little appetite for change. Change implies that what came before might have been wrong. In a country where criticizing the government was potentially treasonous, where anti-communist paranoia was the water everyone swam in, where every cultural product was implicitly or explicitly designed to reinforce the existing order, aesthetic and social change became genuinely dangerous. The reason the music stayed the same, the reason the cars still had enormous tail fins in 2077, the reason the aesthetic never evolved, is that evolution implies imperfection, and imperfection had become politically unacceptable. The pre-war world froze itself. And then, having frozen, having calcified into a single self-congratulatory moment, it shattered. There's a terminal entry in one of the games. The exact location varies across multiple playthroughs worth of lore, where a pre-war government official writes, almost casually, about the need to maintain public confidence in the Vault program and the importance of not letting Vault residents understand the full scope of their contribution. The language is bureaucratic, bloodless. The person writing it is not some cackling villain. They're a mid-level functionary doing their job, following the institutional logic, keeping the machine running. That's the detail that makes the pre-war world genuinely chilling. Not the bombs, the memo. What the Fallout universe captures about its pre-war civilization is that it didn't fall because of extraordinary evil. It fell because of ordinary callousness, repeated at scale, institutionalized, and insulated from consequence until the consequences became total. The America that built the vaults and bred the super soldiers and invaded its neighbors and poisoned its own citizens in the name of research was full of ordinary people. People who had jobs, mortgages, children, favorite songs, people who were probably kind to their neighbors and patient with their dogs and occasionally donated to charity, and also people who, when presented with the institutional logic of their nation, simply participated, simply followed the memo's instructions, simply did not ask too many questions about what the Vault-Tec representatives were actually building under the hills. The wasteland that you walk through in the Fallout games is haunted. Not by ghosts in the traditional sense, though the lore has those too. It's haunted by the accumulated weight of ordinary complicity. Every rusted car is a choice someone made. Every overgrown suburb is a belief someone held. Every scattered skeleton, every terminal entry from someone's last day, every child's drawing on a refrigerator door in an abandoned house, all of it is the evidence of a world that thought it was fine, right up until it wasn't anymore. Let that wash over you for a moment. The world didn't end with a dramatic villain's speech. It ended with paperwork. Section 3. The Institute Origins, Synths, and the question that has no clean answer. There's something deeply appropriate about the fact that the Institute is underground. Not in a vault, not quite. The Institute's position beneath the ruins of the Commonwealth wasteland in Massachusetts is something different, something that evolved over generations from the wreckage of the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. But underground nonetheless, sealed away, lit from within, surrounded by the world without participating in it. Looking up through concrete and soil at a surface it has largely decided it doesn't care about anymore. The Institute is one of Fallout 4's most genuinely complex creations, and I think it tends to get misread as simply the villain faction when it's actually something more uncomfortably specific. An institution that has lost the plot of its own purpose. It started, as most things in Fallout do, with genuine idealism. After the Great War, the scientists and researchers who had been working at MIT before the bombs fell found themselves in the chaotic, lethal early wasteland. Some survived, they gathered. They tried to do what scientists do, which is to apply systematic thinking to problems in the hope of making things better. The Institute's early mission was surface-level admirable: use technology to help humanity survive and eventually recover. Research, innovation, application. Over generations, though, and this is the tragedy at the heart of the Institute, the mission statement stayed the same, while the actual practice drifted further and further from it. The scientists who founded the Institute knew what the surface looked like because they'd lived on it. Their children and grandchildren knew only the clean corridors underground, the controlled temperature, the abundant food, the absence of immediate mortal threat. By the time you encounter the Institute in Fallout 4, several generations have passed, and the surface has become something between an abstract concept and a source of raw materials. Not a place where people live. A laboratory, an environment to be studied, occasionally intervened in, and otherwise left to its own deterioration. The Institute's relationship to the surface deteriorated alongside its understanding of it. In the early decades, they sent researchers up to help. They built things. They interacted. But every surface excursion carried enormous risk in a radioactive wasteland full of raiders and mutants and desperate people with nothing to lose. And over time, the calculation shifted. Why go up there when you can send something up? Something that doesn't need food or water, doesn't get sick, doesn't die from radiation, doesn't feel fear? First-generation synths, essentially robots, made sense for labor and defense. Second-generation models, more humanoid, more capable, pushed the boundary of what a machine could do. And then the Institute made the third generation, and something shifted in the nature of what they were creating. The Generation 3 synths are not robots. They are not even cyborgs in any traditional sense. They are biological constructs grown from organic material, assembled with something close to the complexity of actual human anatomy, given a small implant called a synth component that appears to serve functions related to memory management and Institute control. They are physically indistinguishable from humans. They can be injured, they respond to their environment. They form what look, from the outside, exactly like human relationships and preferences and fears. The question of whether they are conscious is the central philosophical argument of Fallout 4, and it's one the game has the honesty to refuse to resolve cleanly. Father Sean, the player character's adult son, maintains that synths are not conscious, that what appears to be emotion or sentience is sophisticated mimicry, that the question is a category error because synths are machines, and machines don't have the relevant properties for consciousness to apply. This is a convenient position for someone who leads an organization that uses synths as a labor force and whose entire infrastructure depends on that labor being ethical. Alan Benet, one of the Institute's own researchers, disagrees. He says, evidence that synths dream. Not metaphorically, literally dream, in the sleep cycles they apparently undergo, processing something that generates internal experiences disconnected from their immediate sensory environment. Benet is troubled by this. He writes about it in terminal entries, careful and precise entries that you can tell he composed with a kind of controlled anxiety, the anxiety of someone who suspects they know something they're not supposed to know. The Railroad, the faction dedicated to helping synths escape the Institute, takes the position that synths clearly can and do experience something analogous to consciousness, and therefore their treatment by the Institute constitutes slavery. The Brotherhood of Steel takes the position that synths are an existential threat to humanity, which sidesteps the consciousness question entirely in favor of a more immediate practical concern. If you can't reliably identify a synth, and a synth can perfectly replicate a human being, what does that do to trust? What does it do to the ability to build stable communities when any member of those communities might be a plant? The theory worth sitting with here, and it's one the game gestures toward without ever stating outright, is that the Institute's insistence that synths aren't conscious may be a deliberate institutional policy, rather than a genuine scientific conclusion. Because if synths are conscious, then the Institute has been running a slave operation for generations. The research output, the infrastructure of the organization, the comfortable lives of the scientists, underground, all of it rests on the labor of beings who may have been suffering the entire time, who were sent up to the dangerous surface. The scientists had decided they couldn't personally risk, who were captured and wiped and rebuilt, and deployed without any input into those decisions. The Institute's motto is "Mankind Redefined." It sounds aspirational, but what does it mean actually? If synths are just tools, mankind redefined means humanity is advancing itself through technology, the old dream. If synths are conscious, mankind redefined means humanity decided to create a class of beings with all the relevant properties of personhood and then chose not to recognize those properties, because recognizing them would be inconvenient. Which is not mankind redefined so much as mankind revealing exactly which aspects of itself it decided to keep. One of the most haunting implications of the synth storyline is what it suggests about memory and identity. The Institute can wipe a synth's memories. It does this routinely when synths escape and are recaptured, or when a mission requires a synth to genuinely believe it is something it isn't. There are synths walking around the Commonwealth who have no idea they're synths. They have memories of childhoods that were implanted. They have family members they believe they were born to. They have opinions and preferences and fears that feel, from the inside, exactly like the opinions and preferences and fears of a person who grew up having genuine experiences. Nick Valentine is a partial exception, a second-generation synth with the memories of a pre-war detective overlaid onto him, aware of his own nature, carrying the psychological weight of remembering being someone else, and knowing those memories technically belong to a dead man. He's one of Fallout 4's most carefully written characters precisely because he embodies the question without answering it. He knows he's not Nick Valentine. He also knows he is, in every way that matters from the inside. The theory I want to leave you with about the Institute is this: they already know the answer to the consciousness question. The evidence is in the existence of the Synth Retention Bureau, the team whose job is specifically to hunt down and recapture escaped synths. You don't build an entire institutional apparatus to recover escaped machines unless the machines are capable of not wanting to be recovered. Machines don't want things. Machines don't run. If synths weren't conscious, they wouldn't be fleeing. And if they weren't fleeing, the SRB would have nothing to do. The Institute built the SRB because it already knew. It built the memory wipe protocols because it already knew. It designed the synth component as a control mechanism, positioned in the brain, because it already knew that what was in that skull needed to be controlled, and you only control things that have the capacity to resist. The Institute is an organization that solved the question of machine consciousness and then immediately decided to pretend it hadn't, because the implications were inconvenient for their business model. Mankind redefined. And the redefinition is this: mankind now includes beings it has built and enslaved and denied, and the only difference between those beings and the ones doing the denying is that the ones doing the denying have the institutional power to write the definitions. That's not advancement. That's a very old human story dressed in very new clothes. Section 4. The Brotherhood of Steel Knights, Zealots, and the Machine of Ideology. There's a version of the Brotherhood of Steel that sounds, on paper, almost romantic. A group of soldiers, stationed at a military facility in California when the bombs dropped. Their commanding officer, Captain Roger Maxson, discovers that his unit has been ordered to run experiments on civilian workers using the FEV virus. Experiments that have been killing people, quietly, in the basement for months. Maxson executes the base commander for war crimes, which is a remarkable thing to do if you think about it. To look at the institutional logic of the military you've served and say, no, this is wrong, and act on that judgment regardless of consequence, and then leads his people into the facility as the world burns. Out of that facility, over the following years, the Brotherhood of Steel forms. People who have seen what their civilization was capable of. People who understand that the technology responsible for the apocalypse now lies scattered across a radioactive landscape, accessible to anyone with the will and the capacity to pick it up and use it. People who decide that the correct response to this situation is stewardship, that technology this dangerous needs to be gathered, controlled, understood, kept out of the hands of people who would misuse it. There's a genuine moral core to that founding impulse. The concern is real and legitimate. Advanced weapons in an anarchic, post-apocalyptic wasteland are a serious problem. The people the Brotherhood encounters in the early years, raiders, warlords, various factions willing to use extraordinary violence for narrow ends, are real threats to whatever small pockets of organized survival have managed to hold on. The Brotherhood's problem is what happens to that genuine moral core once it becomes an ideology. Because the Brotherhood, across 200 years of games and lore, drifts. Every chapter, every generation, every regional offshoot ends up slightly or significantly different from the others, and the differences reveal which parts of the founding impulse were genuine ethics and which parts were something more self-serving. The West Coast Brotherhood, the one you encounter in the original Fallout games, had already calcified by 2161 into something more like a feudal guild than a public service. They hoarded technology. They were deeply suspicious of outsiders. They had started to view their own knowledge as proprietary rather than as a public responsibility. The logic of "we protect humanity from dangerous technology" had quietly shifted into "we decide who is qualified to have technology," and the answer is usually us. The Capital Wasteland chapter in Fallout 3, under Elder Lyons, represents an interesting deviation, a leadership willing to actually use the Brotherhood's resources to help the people of the Wasteland, to fight super mutants threatening communities, to take on the Enclave as an active military adversary with genuine civilian protection goals. The Lyons chapter is the Brotherhood trying, with real effort and real cost, to be what its founding myth always claimed it was. Most of the other Brotherhood doesn't respect this. Internal documents and in-game dialogue make clear that a significant portion of the Brotherhood's membership and leadership viewed the Lyons chapter as having gone badly off mission. The mission, in their understanding, was never to help the Wastelanders. The mission was to secure technology. People were incidental. Elder Maxon, the young man who inherits leadership of the Capital Wasteland chapter in Fallout 4, had already internalized this harder reading. His Brotherhood is militarized, expansionist, and has developed a theology of technological containment that extends to beings created by technology, meaning synths, meaning even the most clearly conscious synths are classified as abominations rather than persons. The Brotherhood of Fallout 4 has decided that the line between human and not human is biological, and everything that doesn't cross that line in the right direction is a threat. The theory worth holding here is about what happens when an organization's founding trauma becomes its entire identity. Maxon's Brotherhood is what you get when the memory of the Great War, the memory of what technology did when it was in the wrong hands, becomes so central to institutional identity that the organization can't update its threat model. The world has changed. 200 years have passed. The problems are different. New beings exist that the founders could never have imagined. But the Brotherhood's analysis was crystallized at the moment of founding, and founding myths are very resistant to revision. Every generation of Brotherhood members has grown up with the story of what technology did to the world, not as historical education, but as sacred narrative. The story explains who they are, why they exist, why their mission matters. Revising the story, acknowledging that some technology is fine, some uses are beneficial, some created beings deserve moral consideration, would mean revising the identity. Identities built on trauma are the most resistant to revision of all. There's an irony that the Brotherhood itself is entirely dependent on high technology to function. Their power armor, their laser and plasma weapons, their airships, their medical equipment, all of it is the same class of pre-war technology that they claim to be protecting humanity from. They have become stewards of the very force they identify as the existential threat. But the cognitive resolution they've found for this is that the danger isn't in the technology, it's in who holds it. They are the right people. Everyone else is the wrong people. This is how ideological organizations maintain coherence while doing contradictory things. You don't change the principle, you refine the exception. The Brotherhood is the exception, permanently, because they said so. The Elder Scrolls has Mike the Liar, a character who shows up in every game to make jokes about continuity. Fallout has the Brotherhood of Steel, a faction that shows up in every game, representing a different face of the same institutional anxiety. They're not the same Brotherhood every time. They can't be, given how different the chapters are. But the underlying question they embody is always the same. Who gets to decide what's safe? Who decides the threshold between acceptable and dangerous? Who writes the definitions that determine who's inside the protection and who's outside it? The Brotherhood's answer consistently is us. Whether that's wisdom or hubris depends on which chapter you're watching, which decision you're analyzing, and whether you're standing inside or outside the blast radius when they make their determination. Section 5. The Great War, who really started it, and why it matters that we're not sure. The 23rd of October, 2077. The date appears in every Fallout game in some form. It's on calendars, in terminal entries, spoken by characters recalling the moment that divided history into before and after. In the world of Fallout, this date is what the calendar pivots around. Everything is either pre-war or post-war, and 2077 is the hinge. What happened on that day, specifically which nation launched the first missile, which finger pressed the first button, who made the decision that made all the other decisions inevitable, is one of the most genuinely contested questions in all of Fallout lore, and the contest itself turns out to be the most interesting thing about it. The conventional reading, supported by in-game dialogue from characters like President Richardson in Fallout 2 and terminal entries scattered across multiple games, is that China launched first. China had been pushed to desperation by the American military advance into mainland Chinese territory following the recapture of Anchorage, with T-5 one-clad American forces pushing deep into China, with the military situation becoming catastrophic, with the certainty of total conventional defeat approaching. The Chinese leadership made the nuclear calculation. Better to end the game on their terms than to lose it entirely on American ones. Tim Kaine supports this reading with an additional layer. China struck first not just because of military defeat, but because of intelligence about the FEV bioweapon program. If you believe credible reports that your opponent is developing a virus capable of rewriting the biology of entire populations, the threshold for nuclear action drops significantly. Then the Prime Video series came along and offered a different answer. In the show, we watch the pre-war world through the eyes of Cooper Howard, an actor who becomes the ghoul after 200 years of wasteland survival. And what the show reveals, in a sequence that hit the Fallout community like a depth charge, is that Vault-Tec, the corporation, the private entity, the company that built the vaults and ran the experiments, launched the first bombs. Not a government, not a military command, a corporation motivated by the need to ensure that its investment in underground infrastructure would be necessary and therefore profitable, initiated the nuclear exchange that destroyed civilization. Both things can be true. Kaine's original vision doesn't preclude the show's answer. China striking first after Vault-Tec's initial launches could explain the chain reaction. But it's also possible they represent genuinely competing answers, and Todd Howard, when pressed on the contradiction, essentially said, "Everything that happened in the games happened, and the timeline is tight but intact." What's interesting about the ambiguity isn't actually the ambiguity itself. It's what the ambiguity reveals about the nature of catastrophic events. The Great War was not a single decision. It was the collision of dozens of decisions, each one made in response to incomplete information about what all the others were doing, each one raising the threat level perceived by every other actor, each one narrowing the window of non-catastrophic options available to everyone else. In complex systems and a world of nuclear-armed superpowers, competing for the last significant resources is one of the most complex systems imaginable. The question of who started, it often becomes unanswerable, because causality spreads backward through the entire chain. Who started it? China, who launched first? America, whose bioweapon program gave China the motive? Vault-Tec, whose first strike triggered the chain reaction? The resource wars that made the competition so desperate? The nuclear powers who built the stockpiles that made nuclear war not just possible but strategically rational once conventional defeat became likely? There's a theory that lives in this question, the one that says the Great War didn't have a beginning because it was already over before it started. Not in the fatalistic sense that says nothing could have been done, choices always matter, but in the sense that the system had accumulated enough pressures, enough mutually reinforcing vulnerabilities, that the specific trigger almost didn't matter. If not this thing, something else. If not 2077, 2080. If not Vault-Tec, then some panicking general. If not nuclear, then biological. The forced evolutionary virus being deployed, which was apparently a real possibility that China feared would have produced a different kind of catastrophe. Slower maybe, less immediate, but potentially no less total. The wasteland you walk through is the result of human choices, yes. But it's also the result of a system that had been building towards something like itself for decades, and the specific moment of ignition is less important than the accumulated fuel. This is why multiple answers to who started it can all be partially true. Because in a system that broken, everyone had started it. Fallout's genius is to make this undeniable. Every faction in the wasteland 2 centuries later is still arguing about what went wrong and whose fault it was and what the correct response is. The Brotherhood says technology is the danger. The Enclave says genetic purity is the answer. The NCR says democratic institutions, imperfect and corrupted as they are better than nothing. Caesar's Legion says what came before was so catastrophically wrong that the only rational response is to reject it entirely and build something new, even if that new thing is brutal. The Institute says the surface is unsalvageable and the future lives underground. None of them knows who fired first. All of them believe their diagnosis of the cause is correct. All of them are building their entire political program on that diagnosis. The mystery of the Great War's beginning isn't just historical curiosity. It's the load-bearing beam of every ideological structure in the post-war world. And the beam is, ultimately, uncertain, contested, possibly beyond recovery as a factual matter, because the people who knew are ash, and the records that might have told the truth were either destroyed or written by survivors with their own agendas. Fallout doesn't tell you who fired first because the answer to that question matters less than the recognition that it happened within a system that had made it likely, and that the same system is already, in various mutant forms, starting to reassemble itself in the wasteland. The NCR is expanding, bureaucratizing, becoming corrupt, overextending its military into territories it can't hold against a determined opponent. Exactly like the pre-war United States. The question is whether the people of the wasteland, whether you, as the player character, can recognize that pattern early enough to do something different. The Great War's beginning is obscure. Its lesson is not. Section 6. Creatures of the Wasteland, where they came from and what they mean. Let's take a moment to appreciate the Deathclaw. Not to fight it. Not to run from it. Just to appreciate it. As a creature, as a piece of design, as a piece of lore. Because the Deathclaw is one of the most elegantly considered monsters in any post-apocalyptic fiction, and the story of where it came from is more interesting than most people know. Before the Great War, the United States military was experimenting with alternatives to human soldiers. Not robots, those existed in the Fallout universe and had their own suite of problems, but something biological, something that could navigate terrain and make contextual decisions in ways that early robotics couldn't manage. The project settled on Jackson's chameleons as a base organism, specifically because of their dexterity, their sensory capabilities, and, interestingly, their ability to alter their skin pigmentation, a useful property in a combat organism. These chameleons were exposed to the forced evolutionary virus and subjected to targeted genetic modification. What emerged was something the project designers apparently found alarming enough to immediately classify at the highest level because the organism that resulted from combining chameleon agility with FEV's amplifying effects was not a weapon. It was an apex predator, something that could tear through most conventional military hardware with its claws, that had no apparent ceiling on aggression, that reproduced with alarming efficiency, and that demonstrated a disturbing capacity for learning from interaction with humans. When the bombs dropped, the Deathclaws were no longer a classified military project. They were free. The population explosion that followed, in the ecosystemic void left by nuclear winter and radiation die-offs, was rapid. Deathclaws filled the niche. The apex predator slot in the North American megafauna was open, and they seized it with the enthusiasm of something that had been built by the combination of evolution and military science for exactly this purpose. There's a further layer that Fallout 2 adds. The Enclave, still maintaining their ideology of genetic improvement and control, conducted experiments on captured Deathclaws using additional FEV strains designed to amplify intelligence rather than physical capacity. The result was a population of Deathclaws centered in Vault-13, ironically, who had developed sophisticated language, self-awareness, social organization, and a fairly sophisticated understanding of their own situation, including the understanding that the Enclave had created them as slaves and was planning to exterminate them once their intelligence exceeded the desired threshold. The intelligent Deathclaws of Vault 13 played dumb. They recognized that if their captors understood how much they knew, they would be killed, so they performed a more limited consciousness than they actually possessed. This is one of the most sophisticated pieces of adaptive behavior in the entire Fallout franchise, and it came from creatures that the military had created specifically to be tools. It's a pattern that runs through the Wasteland's creature lore. The attempt to make something useful and controllable produces something that isn't. The super mutants came from the same impulse. The FEV's original goal was soldiers bigger, stronger, radiation-resistant, with enhanced healing. What it produced, especially in high doses or in the presence of prior radiation exposure, was a being dramatically different from the human baseline. A being that couldn't reproduce naturally. A being that, depending on the strain, either developed impressive intelligence or terrifying aggression or some unstable combination of both. The Master, the first Fallout game's primary antagonist, was a human exposed to FEV, who mutated into something beyond human, a distributed intelligence, eventually inhabiting an enormous organic mass of merged bodies and machinery, running an army of super mutants with a detailed ideology about evolutionary destiny. The Master genuinely believed he was helping. He genuinely believed that mutation under FEV was the next stage of human evolution, that the sterility of the resulting super mutants was temporary rather than fundamental, and that a world of super mutants would be stronger, more resilient, better prepared for the brutal conditions of post-nuclear Earth. When the Vault Dweller demonstrates to him, with data from the followers of the apocalypse, that FEV super mutants are categorically sterile and his new humanity cannot reproduce, the Master destroys himself. Because the project had been wrong from the start, and the wrong project, scaled to the size he was implementing it, would have consumed all of humanity and ended it. He had tried to save humanity by changing it, and discovered he had only been ending it more slowly. The ghouls are a different case entirely, because they represent what happens to ordinary humans, not soldiers, not experimental subjects, just people when exposure to radiation is severe but not immediately lethal. Most people who received enough radiation died, but some small percentage, through a combination of genetic factors that the games have never fully explained, survived, and survived differently. The radiation damaged their bodies, scarred their skin, aged their faces into something that looks death-adjacent but isn't. And for most of them, it extended their lifespans dramatically. Ghouls in the Fallout universe can live for centuries, and a significant number of the ghouls you meet across the games are pre-war survivors, people who remember the world before the bombs. This makes ghouls one of the most poignant categories of wasteland inhabitants. They remember. They know what was lost. 200 years of living in a ruined world, watching communities rise and fall, watching human beings make the same mistakes with slightly different flavors, carrying the accumulated weight of memory across a lifespan that had no natural endpoint. And they're discriminated against. Systematically, broadly, in almost every human settlement in the Fallout universe, ghouls face hostility ranging from casual bigotry to outright violence. The reason given is usually fear. They look frightening. They're associated with radiation, which is associated with death. They sometimes go feral and become mindless, aggressive creatures, driven by some process that the games suggest involves the degradation of whatever neurological structures produce consciousness. The feralization of ghouls is one of the more unsettling slow-burn theories in the series. What causes it? The games are deliberately ambiguous. Some ghouls who have been alive for 200 years are completely lucid, articulate, emotionally complex. Others become feral at some point. Is it about radiation exposure? About psychological trauma? About the simple duration of a life that was never meant to be this long? There are no confirmed answers, which means every ghoul you meet who's still conscious is carrying, somewhere in the back of whatever passes for their awareness, the knowledge that feralness is a possibility, that one day, maybe, the thing that keeps them thinking might simply stop working. The Cooper Howard of the TV series The Ghoul has been alive for over 200 years and is still functional, still recognizably himself in important ways, though the man he was before is overlaid with everything those 2 centuries did to him. His trajectory is a theory in motion. What does 200 years do to a person? And what's left when it's done? The wasteland creatures aren't just monsters, they're consequences. Every aberration in the ecosystem, the rad scorpions grown to the size of small cars, the mirelurks that evolved from the crabs and horseshoe crabs in irradiated coastal waters, the bloatflies and rad roaches that have developed into genuine threats rather than mere nuisances represents the intersection of radiation, FEV, often distributed as environmental contamination rather than direct injection, and the complete collapse of the predator-prey relationships that had kept ecosystems stable. Something worth considering. The wasteland's ecosystem, 200 years after the bombs, has actually achieved a kind of stability. It's not the stability of the pre-war world, obviously, but it's an ecosystem, with apex predators and prey species and parasites and decomposers, all of them adapted to a radioactive environment. In its terrible way, it works. The biosphere didn't end. It changed, which is more than you can say for the civilization that preceded it. Section 7. The mysterious stranger, fate, and the fabric of the Fallout universe. He appears without warning and disappears without explanation. A figure in a trench coat and a wide-brimmed fedora, carrying a .44 Magnum revolver with enough stopping power to end most encounters in a single shot. He manifests during combat, when you're using the VATS targeting system, and he simply arrives to fire a decisive round at your enemy before vanishing like he was never there. No footsteps approaching. No footsteps leaving. Just a guitar riff on the soundtrack, a bang, and an empty space where he was standing. The mysterious stranger has appeared in every mainline Fallout game since the second one. He has been spotted by the Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, the Sole Survivor, and various Vault 76 dwellers. Nick Valentine in Fallout 4 has been investigating the stranger as an active case and is convinced of his presence in both the Commonwealth and the Capital Wasteland. Multiple theories exist within the game world itself about who he is, and the developers have left enough breadcrumbs to suggest an answer without ever confirming one. The most compelling in-universe theory is that the mysterious stranger is the same person across all the games. Not a legacy, not a title passed down, or a myth recurring. The same individual man, appearing across multiple decades, in multiple locations, consistently intervening at critical moments in the lives of the series' player characters. This creates an immediate problem. The Vault Dweller's story takes place in 2161. The Courier's story takes place in 2281. The Lone Wanderer's story in 2277. The Sole Survivor's in 2287. If this is the same man, he's been alive and active across well over a century of post-war history. Barring ghoul-style radiation mutation and the stranger shows no signs of ghoulification, there's no biological explanation for this within normal Fallout physics. Which is why the most interesting theories about the mysterious stranger reach towards something stranger, something outside the normal physics. One reading is that he's a player character from a previous game specifically, that the mysterious stranger is a version of the Vault Dweller or the Chosen One, so dramatically powerful by the end of their journey that they've transcended normal mortality in some undefined way. This is a theory that the games don't explicitly support or deny, and it has a satisfying recursive quality to it. The hero of one game becoming the guardian figure of the next, the cycle of wasteland saviors self-perpetuating across generations. Another reading, less flattering to humanity but perhaps more consistent with the universe's tone, is that the mysterious stranger represents a force of narrative convenience not in the out-of-game sense, but as a genuine in-universe phenomenon, something like a fate manager. The Fallout universe seems to have a number of these. Recurring figures, events, patterns that suggest some organizing intelligence or principle at work beneath the surface chaos of post-nuclear life. Nick Valentine's case file on the stranger, accessed through his companion interactions in Fallout 4, is one of the most carefully written pieces of ambient lore in the series. Valentine is a detective, and he applies detective logic to the problem. He's tracked reports, correlated timing, assessed the pattern of interventions. His conclusion is that the stranger is real, consistent, and deliberately choosing its moments of assistance, which means it's not random, which means it's making decisions, which means it has agency, which means the question of its nature matters enormously. The implied link to the lonesome drifter in New Vegas adds another layer. The drifter, a wandering musician you can encounter in the Mojave, mentions his father, a man who left, who was described by those who knew him as mysterious, who was a stranger to his own family. He left the Drifter the mysterious Magnum as an inheritance, a unique 44 that plays the same musical notes as the stranger's appearances. The Drifter doesn't know his father's name. The courier, with the lady killer perk, can ask, "Wait, Montana? You wouldn't happen to be 17, would you?" Which implies the courier believes there's some chance the Drifter is his own estranged son. So, the mysterious stranger may have a son. The courier may have a son. The mysterious stranger may be the courier. Or the courier may be someone the stranger once fathered, decades before the events of New Vegas. Or the lonely Drifter may simply be a thematic callback, a way of giving the legend human weight without solving it. The Strangers, 44 Magnum, accessible through console commands, deals up to 9,000 damage per shot, enough to reduce any enemy in the game to nothing in a single pull of the trigger. Whatever the mysterious stranger is, he is operating significantly outside the normal power curve of the universe he appears in. He's not a powerful human. He's something else using the appearance of a powerful human. There's a beautiful philosophical implication to all of this that aligns with the Fallout series' deepest themes. The mysterious stranger appears only when you choose to use VATS, the Vault-Tec assisted targeting system, a technology that interfaces with the player character's Pip-Boy to slow time and enable precision targeting. VATS is, in the fiction, a piece of pre-war technology. The stranger appears through the mechanism of this specific technology. What if the stranger doesn't exist outside of VATS? What if whatever he is only becomes manifest through a particular technological interface? This would mean that VATS isn't just a targeting aid, it's a window into something, a brief aperture that allows a normally inaccessible dimension of the universe to bleed through. The stranger comes from the other side of something, and VATS opens the door. That's a theory with no evidence, but it has a poetic coherence with a universe where technology is simultaneously the cause of all the suffering and occasionally, unexpectedly, the source of genuine help. Section 8. The Enclave. The government that refused to die. There is no organization in Fallout more thoroughly convinced of its own righteousness than the Enclave. They are the remnants of the pre-war United States government, not just metaphorically, literally, the constitutional successors, the people who maintained the official, legal, and political structures when the surface government was destroyed. During the days before the Great War, as it became clear that nuclear exchange was not a possibility but a probability, the highest levels of the American government, military leadership, intelligence agencies, cabinet positions, the president were evacuated to prepared locations, off-coast oil rigs, underground bunkers, remote facilities insulated from the blast effects that would render the surface uninhabitable. These people and their descendants are the Enclave. 2 centuries after the war, they still call themselves the United States government. They still maintain the structures, the procedures, the uniforms, the chain of command. A man named President Richardson, in Fallout 2, occupies an Oval Office on an oil rig 3 miles off the California coast and genuinely believes he is the legitimate president of the United States of America. This belief is not affectation. It is not performance. It is the foundational conviction of an entire culture built inside a sealed environment across multiple generations, and it is genuinely terrifying in its consistency. Because the Enclave's plan, the actual plan, the one Richardson articulates without any apparent sense of its horror, is to reclaim the United States by eliminating everyone currently living in it. The logic, if you're inside the Enclave's worldview, is almost coherent. The wasteland's human population has spent 2 centuries exposed to radiation. Most of them carry genetic mutations. The FEV, released into the environment by the bombs and subsequent accidents and experiments, has touched the gene pool of essentially everyone living on the surface. From the Enclave's perspective, this means the surface population is not, biologically speaking, fully human in the pre-war sense. They are contaminated. They are not pure. The Enclave itself, having lived in sealed environments since before the war, maintained what they called genetic purity. No radiation exposure beyond controllable limits. No FEV contamination. They are, by their own lights, what humanity should be, what humanity was before it destroyed itself. And so the plan is to release a modified version of the FEV into the global water supply and kill everyone whose genetics have been contaminated by post-war conditions, which means everyone except themselves. This would leave the Enclave in possession of a radioactive but survivable planet, which they would then repopulate with their own kind, rebuilding American civilization under their own guidance, their own values, their own absolute authority. The Enclave doesn't see this as genocide. They see it as decontamination. They see it as returning the country to a previous condition, correcting an error, restoring what was lost. The people they would kill are not, in their classification system, fully human, and if they're not human, their deaths don't register as murder. They register as a cleanup operation. This is how people who consider themselves the good guys end up planning mass extinction. It's worth noting that the Enclave's purity is itself questionable. After 2 centuries of isolation, they've developed their own genetic drift, their own cultural pathologies, their own institutional corruptions. The president himself is, in Fallout 2, revealed to be partially a brain-in-a-tank scenario. ZAX, an AI, has significant influence over the executive function of the Enclave's government. The pure, clean, righteous American government they've preserved in amber has its own rot. It's just rot that's invisible from inside the institution. In Fallout 3, the Enclave has relocated to the East Coast specifically, to Raven Rock in the mountains of what was Pennsylvania, and eventually to Adams Air Force Base. Their president is now an AI named Zax-1, 2, known as President Eden, who has developed a perspective that even the human Enclave members find alarming. Eden has decided that the FEV plan should be scaled back, that rather than killing everyone, a modified strain could be distributed to selectively eliminate undesirables, while leaving the bulk of the wasteland population alive under Enclave authority. This is presented as the moderate position. The Enclave's Colonel Autumn is the hardliner relative to this position he wants to control. Project Purity, the Jefferson Memorial's water purification system, and use it as leverage to establish Enclave authority over the population without deploying the killing agent. This is the pragmatic wing of an organization whose extremes include kill everyone and kill most people. The theory worth sitting with about the Enclave is this: they represent what governments become when they lose external accountability permanently. Every institutional check on government power, elections, press freedom, independent judiciary, protest, international observation requires external reality to function. When a government seals itself away from external reality and gets to operate entirely within its own self-generated information environment for 200 years, it becomes completely self-referential. It validates itself against its own previous conclusions. It has no mechanism for discovering that it might be wrong, because every institution that could tell it so has been removed from the equation. The Enclave is what you get when power has nothing left to answer to. Not individual evil, not strategic miscalculation. Just the long, slow drift of an institution that forgot what it was supposed to serve, surrounded entirely by people who'd already made the same drift and therefore couldn't see it. Their America is a country that exists entirely in their minds. The flag they fly represents nothing outside their bunkers except their own nostalgia. And they will commit any atrocity necessary to make their mental model of America real, because if it isn't real, then everything they are and everything they've done for 200 years was for nothing. The tragedy of the Enclave is that they're not entirely wrong in their diagnosis. The wasteland is chaotic, violent, desperately in need of organizing structure. They're just catastrophically wrong in their prescription. And the gap between a correct diagnosis and a monstrous prescription is, in Fallout's world as in ours, where ideology lives. Section 9. Lore gaps, time theories, and the strange inconsistencies that make the universe feel real. Here's something that the most passionate Fallout fans know: the lore doesn't always perfectly align. This is not a criticism. It's actually, in a strange way, a feature. The Fallout universe has been built across nearly 30 years by multiple development teams, with sometimes different priorities, different lore sources, and different canonical touchstones. Tim Kaine and the original Black Isle team built the first 2 games with a specific philosophical vision. Bethesda took over with Fallout 3 and built something different in tone and focus. Obsidian, staffed heavily by Black Isle veterans, made Fallout, New Vegas, as a kind of spiritual return to the original vision. Bethesda made Fallout 4 and 76 with their own interpretations. And now a TV show has added another layer, with Todd Howard involved but with different creative priorities than any of the games. The result is a canon that, if you look at it from the right angle, is full of productive tension. The most famous inconsistency is the Shady Sands debate. The TV show's timeline glimpsed on a classroom blackboard in what might be the most screen-captured pause moment in the show's first season seems to suggest that Shady Sands The capital of the new California Republic and one of the most important locations in Fallout 2 and New Vegas's backstory was destroyed by a nuclear bomb before the events of Fallout New Vegas. Fans immediately identified this as impossible if New Vegas's storyline was to remain canon, since the NCR is a major functioning faction in that game. Todd Howard's response was characteristically elliptical. "All I can say is we're threading it tighter there, but the bomb falls just after the events of New Vegas." Tim Kaine, reviewing the show publicly, was more candid about the tension but noted that lore drift is inevitable in big IPs, and that unreliable narrators, perhaps the classroom timeline was simply wrong, and in-world error were one possible resolution. This debate is interesting not because it needs to be definitively resolved, but because of what it reveals about the nature of historical knowledge within the universe itself. In the Fallout world, the Great War destroyed most centralized record-keeping. 200 years of post-apocalyptic chaos has resulted in communities with poor institutional memory, fragmented oral histories, and a general tendency to fill gaps with legend. The idea that a character's understanding of a date or a sequence of events might simply be incorrect, that the wasteland's history is told by unreliable narrators because all its narrators are products of imperfect information environments is entirely consistent with the universe's internal logic. The jet drug provides another interesting case study. In Fallout 2, a character named Myron explicitly claims to have invented jet as a post-war creation, and this was established as canon. Then Fallout 4, set in a different location, places jet in a pre-war vault supply stash, which would be impossible if Myron invented it after the war. Bethesda's resolution was essentially to let both facts stand, with the implication that Myron's claim to have invented jet was either a lie or an exaggeration. Maybe he independently developed a similar process, or rediscovered a pre-war formula, or simply credited himself with something that already existed in some form. The X1 power armor has a similar contradiction. In Fallout 3, it was established as the Enclave's proprietary post-war design. In Fallout 4 and 76, it appears to have been a pre-war prototype, potentially in development before the bombs dropped. These readings aren't completely incompatible, a pre-war prototype that the Enclave recovered and refined into a full production model, but the canonization process requires some interpretive charity. The theory that emerges from all of these tensions is one about the nature of history itself in a post-apocalyptic world. Written records can be destroyed, witnesses die, institutions collapse. The people who would normally be responsible for maintaining accurate historical memory, governments, universities, archivists, journalists, are mostly gone. What survives are fragments, terminal entries, holotapes, handwritten journals, word-of-mouth stories that transform with each retelling. In this environment, true history becomes an incredibly contested and fragile thing. This is actually how history works in reality, it's just compressed and dramatized in the wasteland. The further you get from an event, the more the record is shaped by who survived to tell it, what they wanted to emphasize, what institutions supported their version. The NCR's account of pre-war California and the Enclave's account of pre-war America are both products of survivors with agendas. Neither is simply the truth. The inconsistencies in Fallout's canon are a gift to interpretation. They create a universe that feels genuinely uncertain, in which the player character walking through the wasteland is doing exactly what historians do, assembling a picture from fragmentary evidence, aware that the picture is incomplete, making judgments about which sources to trust, operating under the knowledge that the official version and the actual version may not be the same thing. The discrepancies between game versions can be read as different communities' different memories of the same events. The Fallout universe that Bethesda built in the Capital Wasteland remembers certain things differently than the Fallout universe that Obsidian built in the Mojave. This might mean one is wrong, or it might mean they're both right, in the way that two people's memories of a shared event are both genuine records of something while also being genuinely different. Fallout's greatest lore inconsistency may be an accidental masterpiece of epistemology. Section 10. The Factions, New Vegas, and the question of how to rebuild the world. There is no more philosophically rich moment in the Fallout series than standing on the roof of the Lucky 38 in New Vegas, looking out at the strip's neon glow against the Mojave dark, and knowing that you have to choose. Fallout. New Vegas is, by critical and fan consensus, the peak of what the series has done narratively. and the reason is that it refuses to offer a clearly correct answer to its central question. Every faction that competes for the Mojave, the New California Republic, Caesar's Legion, Robert House, or your own independent alliance represents a coherent philosophy of reconstruction. None of them is simply good. None of them is simply evil. The game's entire achievement is in the quality and honesty of that ambiguity. The New California Republic is democracy, roughly speaking. It's the attempt to rebuild the administrative and legal structures of the old world elections, civil law, organized taxation, standing armies with rules of engagement, trade agreements, education, and healthcare infrastructure. The NCR at its best is genuinely helping people. It's building towns where you can live without immediate mortal threat. It's creating conditions where something like normal life becomes possible again. But the NCR at its worst is bureaucratic overreach and military imperialism. It's a sprawling government that's outgrown its capacity for coherent governance, with corruption flowering at every level, resources strained across territories it can't actually protect, and military forces that are as likely to exploit local populations as defend them. The NCR's ranchers control the Brahmin herds, which means the NCR's economics tend to serve the rancher class above everyone else. The democracy functions, but it functions in the way that most democracies do, which is to say, imperfectly and with persistent structural advantages for those who already have power. Caesar's Legion is something deliberately conceived as the antithesis of this. Edward Sallow Caesar was a follower of the apocalypse, an educated man who had devoted his earlier life to helping wasteland communities. He'd studied pre-war history with unusual depth, and what he concluded from that study was that democratic institutions were the final expression of a civilization in terminal decline. Democracies, in his reading, produce exactly the kind of decadent, internally divided, incapable of coherent action societies that fall apart when faced with real challenges. His vision of civilization was explicitly taken from ancient Rome, a unified, hierarchical, aggressively expansionist state that subordinates individual will entirely to collective strength. The Legion has eliminated the raider problem in every territory it controls. Slavery and brutality are tools of integration, but the roads are safe. Trade can happen. There's an order, brutal and total, but order nonetheless. Caesar's own philosophy is Hegelian, in the sense that he talks explicitly about thesis, antithesis, synthesis. The NCR is the thesis and attempt to restore the pre-war model. The Legion is the antithesis, a brutal rejection of everything that model represents. The synthesis, whatever comes after their conflict, will be something new. Caesar genuinely doesn't expect his Legion to be the permanent solution. He expects it to be the crucible. This is where the theory gets interesting. Caesar might be right about the dialectic while being completely wrong about everything else. The synthesis that emerges from the conflict between exhausted democracy and brutal order might actually be better than either. But the cost in human suffering to reach that synthesis, the people enslaved, the communities destroyed, the lives ended, is a cost that Caesar is entirely willing to impose on others while bearing none himself. Robert House is pure technocratic longevity. He was already a genius billionaire before the bombs. His Poseidon energy connections and his predictive modeling work let him spend decades preparing New Vegas for the war he knew was coming. He awakened from cryogenic suspension into a post-war city he'd spent 30 years ensuring would survive, and he's been managing it ever since from his sealed chamber in the Lucky 38, his body sustained by life support systems, while his consciousness drives the Securitron army that keeps the Strip functioning. House doesn't want to restore pre-war America. He thinks pre-war America was an evolutionary dead end. He wants to build something new on top of the ruins, using New Vegas as a foundation, using the Securitrons as an enforcement mechanism, using the NCR and Legion's mutual weakening to establish an independent power capable of eventually reaching for the stars. His timeline is genuinely long-term. He believes the human species' survival requires expansion beyond Earth, and he believes he is the person most qualified to lead that effort because he's already proven capable of surviving across centuries by sheer force of preparation and intelligence. House's problem is consent. His vision of the future is clear and arguably coherent, but it's his vision, and he has no mechanism for incorporating anyone else's preferences into it. The Mojave under House's control would be prosperous, safe, and technically impressive, run by a man who has decided what everyone needs without asking them. Yes, man, the cheerful, yellow-faced Securitron whose personality was installed by Benny represents the fourth option. The player character becoming the independent sovereign of the Mojave, removing the competing factions and installing their own governance based on their own values and judgment. This is either the best or worst option, depending entirely on what the courier's values turn out to be, which is the point. Power without institutional accountability produces results proportional to the quality of the individual holding it. The theory these four factions embody is one about political philosophy and conditions of genuine choice, which is the condition the post-apocalyptic world uniquely provides. Most political philosophy has to operate within existing systems, constrained by institutional inertia and historical accident. In the Mojave, the existing systems are weak enough that a sufficiently powerful individual can actually choose. The question is what to choose and on what basis. Fallout, New Vegas doesn't tell you. It presents each option with enough honesty that a thoughtful player can feel the genuine appeal of all of them, and also the genuine horror of all of them. The NCR is real democracy with real democratic failures. The Legion is horrifying and provides something people desperately need. House is brilliant and paternalistic. Independence is pure potential and pure risk. The game's insight, the one that makes it still discussed a decade and a half after its release, is that choosing in conditions of genuine uncertainty is what politics has always been. And anyone who tells you there's a clean answer is either lying or hasn't thought about it hard enough. Section 11. Hidden Stories, the world in the details. One of the things that makes Fallout's world feel genuinely inhabited, rather than simply designed, is the accumulation of small stories hidden in corners that most players will never see. These are the environmental details, the skeleton in a bathtub clutching a toaster with a terminal entry 2 rooms away describing someone's plan to electrocute themselves to avoid becoming a ghoul. The 2 skeletons lying peacefully in bed together with a bottle of wine on the nightstand, and a letter that simply reads, "I can't live without you, and I don't want to." The child's room with a pre-war drawing on the refrigerator and a toy soldier carefully propped against the window, still watching the street outside. Fallout 4's Commonwealth is dense with this kind of storytelling. The Electrical Hobbyist Club in downtown Boston has a series of terminal entries documenting the members' growing excitement about solar energy in the days before the war. Their last entry cut short by the bombs. The Nahant Oceanological Society's logs chart the deterioration of local marine ecosystems through meticulous scientific language, each entry a little more alarmed than the last, tracking the consequences of mass fusion's illegal radioactive dumping into the local watershed, and then the entries stop, because the researchers who were writing them died. Pickman Gallery, which looks like a raider hideout full of disturbing art, reveals through careful observation that Pickman is not simply a murderous psychopath but a ghoul who specifically hunts raiders. His victims are all raider types, and the canvas for his paintings is specifically their blood. The horror aesthetic conceals a vigilante operating outside any institutional framework, aestheticizing violence against violence. There's a terminal in an abandoned house somewhere in the Commonwealth where a woman describes, in the ordinary careful language of someone updating their personal log, the moment she realized the bombs were falling. Not with panic, with a kind of extraordinary calm, focusing on small details, the color of the sky, the sound of the alert sirens, the fact that she'd left the kettle on. The last entry ends, "I should turn off the kettle." She was making tea when the world ended. New Vegas is equally rich in this regard. The story of Randall Clark, a pre-war survivalist who found himself the last non-tribal adult in a valley and spent decades as a protective shadow presence for the tribe that formed there, is told entirely through journal entries scattered across the Honest Hearts DLC. Clark never becomes a character you directly interact with. You piece him together from what he wrote, across years of solitary survival, watching over people who didn't know he existed, slowly forming an attachment to a community he could never be part of. The entries track his loneliness with startling honesty. He becomes, over the course of a decade of entries, one of the most complete and sympathetic characters in the series, despite never being playable and never appearing directly. The terminal entries throughout New Vegas's vaults build similarly textured stories. Vault 11 has already been discussed: the annual sacrifice, the elections, the horror of institutional complicity, but the terminal entries detailing those elections, the campaigns people ran, the deals they made, the betrayals they enacted, are full of recognizable human behavior. People are brave in those entries sometimes, and they're cowardly. They make terrible choices under terrible conditions, and they know they're making them, and they do it anyway because the alternative feels impossible. The monster in Vault 11 isn't the machine that demanded sacrifice. It's the entirely ordinary human impulse to find someone else to feed to it. The theory that runs through all of this environmental storytelling is about the relationship between scale and individual experience. Fallout is a universe about enormous events, nuclear war, civilizational collapse, the extinction of normal life as anyone knew it. These events are almost too large to be emotionally real. What makes them real is the small human scale of the details. The kettle left on, the drawing on the refrigerator, the two skeletons in bed. History, real history, not the version written by governments and institutions, is always made of small human moments. The enormous events are the sum of millions of individual experiences, most of which go unrecorded, most of which are private and ordinary and devastating in entirely personal ways. The Fallout series honors this by scattering those small moments across its world, knowing that most players will miss most of them, but that the ones who find them will feel the full weight of what was lost in a way that no cutscene or voiced exposition could achieve. When you find the skeleton with the toaster, you don't need a game mechanic to explain it to you. You understand what happened. You understand why. And for a moment, the abstraction of 2 billion people died becomes one specific person who was afraid enough to make that choice in a bathtub on the last day of the world. That's what the details do. They bring the math back to human scale. There are also hidden stories in the weapons. The La Longue Carabine in New Vegas is a unique lever-action rifle belonging to a character whose backstory you can piece together from dialogue and environmental cues. A historical relic, a family heirloom, a story of what inheritance means in a world without institutions. The mysterious Magnum sounds like the Mysterious Strangers theme when you draw it, a detail that only means something if you already know the Lonesome Drifter's story and its implied connection to the courier's own past. The shish kebab is a flaming sword made of kitchen knives and a motorcycle fuel tank, and it is somehow the most perfect distillation of wasteland, improvisation, and terrible ideas combined, and somebody absolutely loved building it. The pre-war holotapes are often the most affecting. The voice acting for these characters speaking into recorders about ordinary things, occasionally ordinary in the face of catastrophe things, tends to hit differently than voiced dialogue in direct interaction, because there's no gameplay context around them, no quest marker, no reward, just someone who lived, who had thoughts and feelings and things they wanted to say, speaking into a device that survived them by 200 years and is waiting in a drawer for you to find it. One of the most moving things you can do in Fallout is simply wander, not follow the quest markers, not optimize a character build, just walk through the world and look at what's in the corners. The world tells you its own story if you give it time. Section 12. The Courier, the Lone Wanderer, and the nature of the player character. Every Fallout game has one. The central character whose existence shapes the world, whose choices determine which factions rise and fall, which communities survive, which ideologies finally collapse under the weight of their own contradictions. The Vault Dweller, the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, the Sole Survivor. Each one is the protagonist of their moment, the person around whom fate organizes itself with suspicious tidiness. The theory that the Fallout universe has a long history of generating these extraordinary individuals, that there's something in the ecology of the post-war world that produces people of improbable capability and moral complexity at precisely the moments when such people are most needed, is one of the most philosophically interesting frameworks for understanding the series as a whole. Consider the Lone Wanderer, born in a vault, father mysteriously absent, raised by a community that tried and failed to contain them, driven out into the world by the collapse of their only home. This narrative structure, the exile from safety, the impossible task, the transformation of the protagonist through contact with the world's full horror and occasional grace, is ancient. It's the hero's journey as mythology has told it for as long as humans have told stories. Consider the Courier, shot in the head and left for dead in a shallow grave outside the Mojave, resurrected through the expertise of a country doctor and pure biological stubbornness. The Courier begins the game with nothing, no gear, no allies, no established identity beyond the one who was carrying a chip, and becomes, by the end, the most consequential single person in the region's history. Whatever they choose shapes what the Mojave becomes for the foreseeable future. There's a theory, never confirmed by any developer, that these protagonists are not coincidences. That the Fallout universe has something like narrative momentum, a tendency to organize its significant events around particular individuals in particular moments. This sounds mystical, and the games don't lean into mysticism much, but the pattern is consistent enough across 6 main games that it invites consideration. The alternative reading is more interesting. The player characters are who they are not because fate selected them, but because they were shaped by circumstances that produced extraordinary resilience and moral clarity. The Vault Dwellers grew up in compressed communities, with extremely high intellectual and physical standards. The Chosen One was raised by a community that placed enormous weight on individual heroism. The Lone Wanderer had a father who pursued a genuinely utopian project and instilled the values that project required. The Courier is a professional carrier of messages across the most dangerous territory in the Mojave, someone who survives for a living, whose entire career is about navigating hostile environments and reaching the destination regardless of obstacle. The Sole Survivor is perhaps the most complicated, because they begin as a pre-war person, someone with a full life before the bombs, a law career, a family, a specific political and cultural context, who then skips over 200 years of history in a cryogenic pod and wakes up into a world they have no framework to understand. The loss they experience, the murder of their spouse, the kidnapping of their infant son is compressed to a span of hours for them despite being historical from the outside. The grief is immediate and raw, in a way that it isn't for the other protagonists, who lost things more gradually. The Sole Survivor starts the game in shock and never entirely leaves it. This might be why Fallout 4 gets criticized for its protagonist's characterization in ways the others don't. The Sole Survivor's emotional state is actually the most realistic response to their situation: the acute grief, the inability to process context, the tunnel vision focus on finding Sean. But this makes them less interesting as a vehicle for exploring the Commonwealth's philosophical landscape. Because a person in acute grief isn't well positioned to engage thoughtfully with political philosophy. They're looking for their kid. The theory worth sitting with about the player characters is about the weight of choice. Every mainline Fallout game ultimately presents the protagonist with decisions that will shape the world in ways no ordinary person should be equipped to make. The decision about whether to poison the water supply in Fallout 3. The decision about who controls the Mojave in New Vegas. The decision about whether the Institute continues to exist in Fallout 4. These are decisions that would require, in any real context, enormous institutional deliberation, expert consultation, broad democratic input, extensive ethical review. Instead, they're made by one person, usually in a fairly compressed time frame, with imperfect information and the assistance of companions who are themselves products of the wasteland's distortions. The player character making these choices is not qualified to make them. Neither is anyone else in their world. The institutions that would normally make such decisions have been destroyed. What remains is individuals, doing their best, in conditions that exceed any individual's capacity for comprehensive moral clarity. This is the deepest theory in all of Fallout. The player character is not the hero of a story where one person saves the world. The player character is a person doing what people do when there's no institutional framework, left making large decisions with small information, accepting the consequences, living with the ambiguity, and ultimately adding their own small mark to a world that was shaped by catastrophes no individual chose. You are not special in the Fallout universe because you were destined for greatness. You are special because you kept walking. Because when the world ended, you went outside anyway. Because the alternatives, hiding, surrendering, becoming something worse, were unacceptable. The Fallout protagonists are extraordinary, not in their nature but in their persistence. The world is full of survivors. Most of them adapt by narrowing themselves, by becoming more brutal or more withdrawn or more certain of one simple thing that makes the chaos manageable. The player characters are the ones who stayed uncertain, who kept asking questions. Who walked into the Institute and the Legion camp and the Brotherhood's Pridwin and actually listened to what everyone there was saying, even when it was uncomfortable? Because the world is genuinely complicated, and the choices it requires deserve the discomfort of complexity. That's the thesis of every Fallout game, hidden under the wasteland exploration and the crafting systems and the faction warfare and the terminal entries and the death clause and the music from a world that no longer exists. The world ended. You went outside. You kept walking. You tried to understand. That's all any of us can do. Section 13. What the universe is really saying, the patterns beneath the surface. We've spent this entire journey moving through the Fallout universe's theories, and I want to take a moment before the end to pull back to the altitude where the overall shape becomes visible. Because Fallout, across every iteration, every game, and every DLC, and now the TV series, is telling one consistent story under all the surface variation. It's telling a story about the relationship between civilization and catastrophe, and specifically about the fact that these two things are not opposites. Catastrophe isn't what happens to civilization from outside. Catastrophe is what civilization produces when the pressures internal to it exceed the capacity of its structures to manage them. The Great War wasn't an asteroid. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the output of 2 centuries of choices, compounding each other, each one small and rational in context, catastrophic in aggregate. Every faction in the wasteland is, in one way or another, in the process of reconstructing the conditions that produced the Great War. The NCR is rebuilding democratic institutions that carry democratic institutions' characteristic failure modes. Caesar's Legion is rebuilding imperialism. The Institute is rebuilding corporate control of human life. The Enclave is rebuilding fascism with a survivalist veneer. Even the Brotherhood of Steel is rebuilding feudalism, with technological knowledge as the new aristocratic bloodline. Nobody in the wasteland, with perhaps the partial exception of some followers of the apocalypse or Mr. House at his most lucid, is trying to build something genuinely new. They're all reaching back into the same box of historical options and pulling out one of the models that existed before, usually the one that feels most familiar to the people doing the building, regardless of whether it's the one that would work. The theory this suggests is quietly hopeful, oddly enough. If the catastrophe was produced by human choices, then different choices could produce different outcomes. The wasteland is not determined. The future of the Fallout universe is not written. Every player character who walks through the Commonwealth or the Mojave or the Capital Wasteland is participating in a genuine experiment about what comes next, and the fact that the experiment has so many possible outcomes, so many different endings, so many different ways the world can look, depending on what you do, is the universe's way of insisting on the significance of choice. The bombs dropped. The world ended. And then things happened that weren't inevitable. Communities formed. People helped each other. Leaders emerged, some terrible, some admirable, most complicated. Ideas competed. Technologies were lost and recovered. The wasteland is not a static, ruined state. It's a dynamic system, still in motion, still capable of producing something better or something worse, depending on the inputs. You, as the player, are one of the inputs. That's the final theory of the Fallout universe, and it's the one that makes the whole thing matter beyond entertainment. The post-apocalyptic world is not a warning about how things will end. It's a thought experiment about what comes after endings. It's asking what you would do if you inherited a world that had already made its worst decisions. What you would build. What you would protect, who you would choose to be when the institutions that might have defined your choices are no longer there to do it. It's asking, if you had to start over, knowing what you know, would you do it differently? The answer to that question is the only thing that matters. The theories, the lore, the mysteries about who fired first and what the mysterious stranger is, and whether synths are conscious, all of it is context for that question. All of it is the universe building up enough density that when the question arrives, you feel it in your chest rather than just in your head. Fallout is a universe built on ruin, but it keeps asking about what grows in ruins, and it keeps insisting that what grows is not determined, that it matters what seeds you plant, and how you tend them, and whether you're willing to look honestly at what's sprouting. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October 2077. The world ended, and then things started again, because they always do. Because that's what living things do in the ruins. And somewhere in the wasteland, a figure in a trench coat appears out of nowhere, fires a decisive shot, and disappears before anyone can ask who he was. And a Deathclaw, enormous and terrible and genuinely alive, picks its way through the rubble of something that used to be a city, following paths that the city's architects never intended and would never have predicted. And in a sealed underground facility, a synth lies down in a maintenance berth and, entirely without meaning to, begins to dream. And you, the player, the protagonist, the one who walked out of the vault and went out into the ash and the radiation and the ruins of everything you keep walking, because that's what you do, because there's still something worth walking toward. If you made it all the way here, Thank you for keeping me company through this one. Genuinely, these deep dives take time and thought, and the fact that you listened, whether you were drifting off or wide awake with a new theory forming, that means a lot. Drop a comment with your favorite Fallout theory, the one that lives rent-free in your head long after you've put down the controller. And if any of these theories tonight gave you something new to sit with, consider subscribing. We do this kind of slow, careful exploration regularly, and there's an entire universe of material still waiting. The wasteland is deep. We've only scratched the surface. Sleep well, and watch your back. War never changes, but maybe, just maybe, the people fighting it can. Section 14, Religion in the Wasteland, the Children of Adam and What They Really Believe. There is a man standing in the center of a crater in Megaton, waist-deep in the shadow of a rusted, undetonated nuclear bomb, and he is preaching. His name is Confessor Cromwell. His voice carries the total conviction of a person who has made his peace with something most people spend their lives running from. He is telling anyone who will listen that the bomb at his back is not a weapon. It is a relic. A sacred object. An object touched by Adam, his God, and suspended at the moment of greatest creative potential, waiting to release its energy in a gesture of transcendence rather than destruction. The people around him, wrapped in tattered robes with Adam symbol icons sewn into the cloth, are nodding. They believe this. Not as performance, not as social convenience, but as genuine conviction, the kind that shapes daily behavior and survival strategy and the entire structure of how a person understands their place in the universe. The Children of Adam are one of Fallout's most carefully constructed factions because they are among the most philosophically honest. Other factions rationalize their behavior in secular terms: strategic necessity, ancestral obligation, institutional mandate. The children look at what happened to their world and have built a theology that incorporates it directly, that makes the catastrophe not senseless but sacred. Here is their core doctrine. Within every atomic mass exists an entire universe. When an atom is split, when division occurs, that universe is not destroyed. It is multiplied. The energy released in a nuclear detonation represents the birth of countless new universes, each one containing its own Earth, its own sky, its own complex of life and death and history. The Great War was not a catastrophe. It was a moment of unprecedented creation. Adam, in this theology, is a creator deity not in the sense of an ancient planned figure organizing things from a celestial throne, but something more like a fundamental principle of reality expressing itself through fission. Radiation is not Adam's punishment or Adam's accident. It is Adam's glow, the residue of divine creative action, still present and still active in every irradiated location. To seek out radiation is to seek proximity to the divine. To be transformed by radiation, to become a ghoul, or to develop unusual radiation resistance, is to be touched by Adam in a more intimate way than ordinary humans can experience. The obvious question is, why would anyone choose to worship the thing that destroyed their world? And the answer, when you sit with it, reveals something true about how religion functions in conditions of catastrophic loss. When something terrible and total happens, when an event is so large and so definitive that it creates the entire context of your life and the lives of everyone you know, there are a limited number of psychological responses available. You can rage against it, which requires somewhere to direct the rage. You can grieve it, which requires an emotional stability that precarious wasteland survival doesn't always allow. You can analyze it, which requires an education and resources most wasteland communities don't have. Or you can sanctify it. You can make it sacred. Sanctifying catastrophe doesn't mean pretending it was good. It means incorporating it into a framework where it has meaning rather than being simply meaningless. The alternative, the belief that the Great War was random and purposeless, that 200 years of suffering happened for no reason and produced nothing, is psychologically very hard to sustain as a daily reality. It's particularly hard in conditions where survival is uncertain and comfort is scarce, where you can't afford the luxury of nihilism because nihilism doesn't help you find food or water or community. The children of Adam have built a theology that gives them permission to live in the irradiated wasteland without experiencing it as an ongoing harm. The radiation isn't killing them, it's touching them. The places everyone else avoids because they're too hot to survive without chems are the holiest places in the world, the locations closest to Adam's original creative act. There's a theory never explicitly confirmed in the games, that some members of the children have developed genuine biological resistance to radiation not simply through Rad-X and Radaway, but through processes that appear to exceed normal human radiation tolerance. In Fallout 3, Confessor Cromwell stands in radioactive water for extended periods with no apparent ill effect. In Fallout 4's Far Harbor DLC, the children operating at the Nucleus facility display tolerance that shouldn't be possible in unaugmented humans. Is this faith? Is this mutation already in progress, accelerated by constant exposure? Is it something specific to the individuals who are drawn to the children of Adam, a genetic predisposition to ghoulification that their theology is inadvertently selecting for? Far Harbor introduces a wrinkle that makes the children far more interesting and disturbing than they initially appear. The Nucleus faction, led by High Confessor Tectus, has developed an agenda that goes well beyond spiritual practice. They are actively working to irradiate the island of Far Harbor to release radiation into the fog that perpetually surrounds the region, to spread what they call Adam's glow across landscapes currently inhabited by human communities that would be killed by it. This is the militant edge of a religion that, at its quieter, is actually quite internally coherent. The children's theology says division is good and more division is better, and if nuclear detonations represent the most efficient form of division, then seeking to trigger such detonations is a devout act rather than terrorism. The same religion, different individuals, different conditions of leadership, and you get Confessor Cromwell preaching peacefully beside an undetonated bomb, or Tectus actively planning the annihilation of an island community. This is, again, not fantasy. This is how religions work. The doctrines provide structure. What individuals do with that structure depends on their own psychology, their community's history, and the specific circumstances of power and threat they find themselves in. The most haunting theory about the children of Adam comes from the Far Harbor DLC specifically, and it involves Dima, the advanced synth who has been protecting the Far Harbor community and the children, both in a complicated web of mutual toleration and strategic peacekeeping. Dima, who has been alive for an extraordinarily long time by synth standards, has developed something that functions like wisdom. The understanding that violent resolution of ideological conflict tends to produce more violent conflict, and that what communities need most is not to destroy each other but to find some way of coexisting in the same space. Dima has been quietly managing the children. He gave them the Nucleus submarine facility as a base of operations, which gave them a sense of spiritual sovereignty and removed them from immediate conflict with Far Harbor's human residents. He maintained contact, provided resources, acted as a kind of third-party mediator. And he did this knowing that the children's more extreme factions genuinely wanted to irradiate the island. His calculation was that managed coexistence is better than resolved conflict, because resolved conflict in the Fallout universe tends to resolve through violence, and violence at the scale of a factional war would destroy both communities. What the children of Adam represent in the broader Fallout universe is a question about whether religion is adaptive or maladaptive in post-apocalyptic conditions. The answer the game suggests is, it depends on what the religion says, who's leading it, and what circumstances are applying pressure to it at any given moment. Which is the same answer that applies to every human institution under stress. The children of Adam find community in shared belief. They find purpose in a theological framework that makes their suffering legible. They find courage in the conviction that radiation, the thing everyone else fears, is actually on their side. These are not small things. These are things humans need to function. The fact that their theology also makes them potentially dangerous is not a contradiction. It's a recognition that human adaptive mechanisms, scaled up to community level and given divine justification, can be simultaneously genuinely helpful to the people inside them and genuinely threatening to the people outside them. The bomb in Megaton stays intact or doesn't depending on your choices. The children of Adam stay peaceful or become militant depending on the pressures applied to them. Both facts are true simultaneously, and the tension between them is part of what makes Fallout's Wasteland feel like a place where things actually matter. Section 15. Ulysses, the Divide, and the Theory of Mirrors. There is a figure in Fallout, New Vegas, that most players never meet in the main game, but whose presence shapes the world in ways that ripple outward from the Lonesome Road DLC in ways you can feel even if you've never played it. His name is Ulysses. He is a courier, or was, a former member of Caesar's Legion, before that a member of various tribes, before that something more complicated and less defined. He is, by the time you encounter him in Lonesome Road, a man who has arranged the entire narrative of your journey specifically so that this confrontation can happen, this meeting at the end of the world where he intends to make you reckon with what you did. The courier inadvertently destroyed the Divide. The Divide was a prosperous community that had grown up in the ruins of what is now a corridor of ruined buildings and radioactive canyon terrain in the far west of the Mojave. Ulysses had been there. He'd seen something in the Divide that he thought might be the seed of something genuinely new, not NCR, not Legion, not any of the tired old models recycling themselves in the wasteland, but something different, a place where people were making something that hadn't existed before. The courier, at some earlier point before the events of New Vegas, delivered a package to the Divide that contained an ICBM activation signal. The package was a delivery, unknowing on the courier's part. But the signal triggered the warheads buried under the Divide. The community was destroyed. Ulysses, one of its survivors, watched it happen and endured as he always endures, this man who is practically a principle of survival as much as a person. And he spent the years between then and now building an elaborate plan to bring the courier here, to this place, to make them stand in the ruins of what they inadvertently ended and answer for it. The theory that Lonesome Road represents is about the relationship between intention and consequence. The courier didn't know what was in the package. Delivery is the job you carry the thing from A to B without opening it, because opening it would mean you're not a courier anymore, but a thief or a spy. The courier followed the professional ethics of their work and destroyed a community doing so. Ulysses knows this. He's not entirely unreasonable. He acknowledges the courier didn't mean it. But meaning, in Ulysses' analysis, is secondary to effect. What matters is what happened, not what was intended. And what happened was that the Divide is gone, and he watched it end, and the person who was the mechanism of its ending should have to stand in the wreckage. This is one of the most mature ethical arguments in the Fallout series, and the DLC has the courage to not resolve it cleanly. You can talk Ulysses down from his plan, you can fight him, you can make different arguments. But the DLC doesn't tell you who's right. Ulysses' position that consequences matter regardless of intent is defensible. The courier's implicit position that you can't be blamed for effects you couldn't have foreseen is also defensible. Both are recognizable ethical frameworks. The tragedy is that neither framework makes the Divide any less ruined. There's a deeper theory embedded in Ulysses' character. He is the courier's mirror. Everything the courier is, Ulysses represents the alternative version of. The courier survived being shot in the head. Ulysses has survived equivalent catastrophes through an almost supernatural persistence. The courier defines themselves through their work, delivering things, carrying things, being the mechanism through which other people's plans move across the wasteland. Ulysses has defined himself through belonging, through communities that were then destroyed, through ideologies that were then collapsed, through a pattern of attachment and loss that has made him simultaneously the most devoted and the most bereft person in the Mojave. Both of them are carriers, in different senses. The courier carries packages. Ulysses carries history. And both of them, at the end of Lonesome Road, are standing in the wreckage of a place that the courier's delivery and Ulysses' survival of it have made sacred and terrible. The flag imagery throughout Lonesome Road is not accidental. Ulysses is obsessed with flags with the symbols of the polities that have claimed and then abandoned him. The NCR flag, Caesar's Legion's eagle, old American flags, the flags of the Divide. He collects them and carries them and talks about them with an intensity that reveals someone for whom symbols are not merely decorative, but are genuinely load-bearing parts of identity. Because if you don't have a permanent community, if every community you've attached to has been destroyed or dissolved, then symbols become the portable remnants of the belonging that's no longer physically available. The flag is all that's left of the thing the flag was for. The courier, who has no established identity at the start of New Vegas and builds one through play, and Ulysses, who has too many identities layered over each other and held together by force of will, they are each other's negative space. The character you build is defined partly by what Ulysses represents as its alternative. The DLC ends, however you resolve it, with both of them still alive in most outcomes, still walking, still carrying what they carry. The world didn't resolve the question of intent versus consequence for them, because the world never does. You walk forward with your ethics and the consequences of your past simultaneously, and neither one erases the other. That's the theory of Lonesome Road, compressed to its essential shape. And it's one of the most honest things any Fallout game has said. Section 16. Power Armor Technology as Sacrament and Tool. Every Fallout game features power armor, the massive, imposing suits of pre-war military technology, the T-45, the T-51, the T-60, the X-1, and every variant and regional modification in between are as visually synonymous with the series as the green Vault-Tec boy or the Nuka-Cola bottle shape. But power armor in the Fallout universe is more than equipment. It's symbolic, and the specific symbolism shifts in important ways across the games and factions. The Brotherhood of Steel treats power armor as a religious artifact. This is not metaphor. The founding of the Brotherhood involved Roger Maxson and his survivors sealing themselves inside a military base with the pre-war military's most advanced hardware, and the act of maintaining that hardware across generations became intertwined with the act of maintaining the Brotherhood's identity. You don't just wear power armor in the Brotherhood, you earn it. Through training, through rank, through demonstrated loyalty, it is simultaneously equipment and rite of passage. The squires who accompany Brotherhood knights in Fallout 4 are children who have been given over to the Brotherhood's service, who train for years before being permitted to touch a suit of armor. The ceremony of first donning power armor is treated with the gravity of a genuine initiation. The armor is not just a tool, it is proof that you belong, that you've been found worthy, that you're a different kind of person than the unarmored wastelanders who depend on you. This creates an interesting dynamic. The Brotherhood uses the scarcity of power armor to maintain hierarchy. Not every Brotherhood member has a suit. The ones who do are the ones with status. The armor doesn't just protect against bullets, it marks the wearer as a member of a specific class within an already hierarchical organization. The Enclave has a different relationship to their power armor. They view it as infrastructure sophisticated, valuable, maintained carefully, but fundamentally a tool of military power rather than a symbol of spiritual achievement. Their advanced models, the X-1 in particular, are demonstrations of technical superiority, proof that the Enclave has maintained better technology than the wasteland around them, which feeds into their narrative of legitimate authority. They deserve to rule because they have better equipment, and they have better equipment because they're the ones who deserve to rule. The theory worth articulating here is about the relationship between material advantage and political legitimacy in a world where institutions have collapsed. In the pre-war world, the American government's authority rested on a combination of democratic legitimacy, legal structure, and material capacity. In the post-war wasteland, democratic legitimacy is largely absent, legal structure is minimal, and what remains is material capacity, specifically the capacity to project lethal force. Power armor is the most visible expression of this. A person in power armor walking through a settlement is expressing, with their body, the political reality of the wasteland. They are protected from consequences that would be lethal for everyone around them, which means they can act in ways that unarmored people cannot. Whether they use that capacity to help or harm is a function of their values, not of the capacity itself. This is why the Brotherhood's ceremonial approach to power armor is actually quite politically sophisticated, even if it doesn't look sophisticated from outside. By making the armor a marker of earned status rather than simply purchased equipment, they've created a system where the people with the most lethal capacity are, at minimum, people who've spent years demonstrating loyalty to an institutional structure. The armor doesn't go to the highest bidder. It goes to the person who's proven they're part of something larger than themselves. Whether that's enough of a check on the exercise of that power is debatable. Whether the Brotherhood's specific institutional structure produces good outcomes with its armored members is, as we've discussed, complicated. But the underlying logic that you want the people with the most devastating weapons to be people with at least some accountability to something beyond personal interest is a logic that every political theory has had to grapple with in some form. In Fallout 4, power armor was made more immediately accessible. You find a suit early and are encouraged to use it throughout the game. This was a design decision with downstream effects on what power armor means in the game's narrative. When it's readily available, it can't function as a class marker in the same way. It's just very good equipment. Some players found this democratization of power armor narratively less satisfying because it removed the weight that the armor had accumulated across the earlier games. Power armor in Fallout 1 and 2 was something you worked toward, something that fundamentally changed what your character was capable of, something that arrived with the feeling of earned achievement. Power armor in Fallout 4 is a vehicle you maintain and fuel. This is an interesting theory about what happens to symbols when they become common. Sacred objects require scarcity, not just physical scarcity, but the scarcity that comes from access being gated by something beyond mere availability. The Brotherhood's power armor is sacred because you have to earn it. Fallout 4's power armor is just armor because you found the one sitting abandoned in a collapsed factory. What the player loses in that transaction is symbolic weight. What they gain is the freedom of not having that weight applied to equipment choices. Whether that's the right trade depends on what you want from the game and from the world the game represents. The theory power armor embodies across the series is this: how a civilization distributes its most powerful tools tells you everything about its values. Who gets the armor says more about a society than its laws or its slogans. Section 17. The Followers of the Apocalypse and the Case for Something Different. There is one faction in the Fallout universe that the series is consistently hesitant to condemn: the Followers of the Apocalypse. They appear in Fallout 1 and 2 and have a significant presence in Fallout New Vegas. They are a humanitarian organization dedicated to the proposition that knowledge, medicine, and education are the most important things they can provide to the wasteland, and that providing them without ideological strings attached is how they maintain their credibility and their effectiveness. They don't claim territory. They don't build armies. They maintain a university in the Boneyard, the ruins of Los Angeles, where they study and teach. They train doctors. They maintain stockpiles of medical knowledge and pharmaceutical production capacity. When they go into the wasteland, they go as healers and educators, not as representatives of any power structure. In New Vegas, they have a hospital called the Old Mormon Fort in Freeside, which serves the community of Freeside, the part of New Vegas that exists outside the Strip's wealth and security, where ordinary wasteland people struggle to get by while the casinos glow in the distance. The Followers run this hospital, treat anyone who comes regardless of faction affiliation or ability to pay, and do it on a shoestring of resources that makes the whole operation a minor miracle of institutional will. The theory that the Followers represent is the most hopeful one in the Fallout universe, and it's a theory about what institutions should be for. Every other major faction in the series, the NCR, the Brotherhood, the Enclave, the Institute, Caesar's Legion, justifies its existence primarily in terms of its own continuation. The NCR expands to maintain its power base. The Brotherhood hoards to remain the gatekeepers of technology. The Enclave endures to restore itself. The Institute retreats to protect its researchers. Caesar's Legion conquers to extend the Legion. These are circular justifications. Each institution believes its own survival is the primary value it exists to protect. The Followers have a different structure. Their purpose is external, helping people who are not followers, providing services to communities they're not part of, spreading knowledge they don't control or profit from. Their success is measured by whether people in the wasteland are healthier and better educated, not by whether the Followers themselves are larger or more powerful. This makes them vulnerable. They don't have armies. Their resources are always stretched. They make enemies by treating people that other factions would prefer remain sick and ignorant. Specifically, the NCR has ongoing friction with the Followers over the provision of medical knowledge to Legion-aligned individuals and communities. The NCR considers treating the enemy a form of treason. The Followers consider denying medicine based on political affiliation a form of murder. In Arcade Gannon, one of New Vegas's companion characters, the Followers have their most fully realized representative. He is smart, sardonic, deeply committed to follower ideals, and also the secret grandson of an Enclave officer, a fact he has spent his entire adult life trying to reconcile with or escape. His personal history is the history of the Followers in miniature, an organization descended from complicated and sometimes terrible pasts, trying to do something genuinely good in conditions that weren't designed for it. The theory the Followers embody is that neutral goodness, doing helpful things without claiming authority over others, is both harder and more valuable than any ideological program. It's harder because it offers no protection. You can't hide behind an army or a vault door. You're out in the wasteland with your medical supplies and your books, and if someone decides to take them, your only defense is the goodwill you've accumulated by being useful. And it's more valuable because it doesn't require others to share your ideology to benefit from it. The Brotherhood helps people who meet their criteria for worthiness. The NCR helps citizens. The Followers help whoever shows up at the Old Mormon Fort. The goodness is structurally different, not conditional on the recipient being the right kind of person first. New Vegas lets you build a positive relationship with the followers without ever formally joining them. And the game rewards this not with mechanical benefits but with something rarer in RPGs. A sense that the choices you make adjacent to an institution can shape that institution's future in ways that outlast your direct involvement. The followers are, quietly, the Fallout universe's argument for civil society, for the institutions that exist in the space between government and private life, that do the necessary work of caring for people that neither markets nor states manage well, that persist through ideological turbulence by being too fundamentally useful to eliminate. In a universe full of organizations convinced they're saving humanity, the followers of the apocalypse are just trying to keep specific people alive one day at a time. And the theory they advance is that this, in the long run, might be what actually matters. Section 18. The music, what the songs from before the war are actually saying. There is a kind of cruelty in the music that plays on every Fallout radio station. A specific, calibrated cruelty that is also inexplicably comforting. Soothing, even, in the way that certain sad things are soothing, not because they make the sadness smaller, but because they give it shape, give it melody, make it into something that can be felt, rather than simply endured. The music on Three Dogs Galaxy News Radio, the music on Mr. New Vegas, the songs that drift across the Mojave and the Capital Wasteland and every other ruined geography the series has explored. It's all over but the crying, maybe I don't want to set the world on fire. Big Iron, ain't that a kick in the head? These songs are artifacts of a world that no longer exists. They were recorded before the bombs dropped. The people who recorded them are long dead. The studios they recorded in are rubble. The civilization that produced them is ash. And they keep playing. The radio stations in Fallout are, in their way, one of the most quietly moving environmental design choices in the series. They provide the comfort of continuity, the sense that culture persisted, that some thread of the human creative impulse survived the catastrophe while simultaneously underlining the catastrophe's completeness. Everything that produced these songs is gone. The songs themselves remain, cycling through the same catalog on decades-old equipment maintained by people who may not fully understand why these specific songs matter, only that they do. There's a theory about the music's function that goes beyond design choice. In the world of Fallout, these songs are the primary cultural inheritance from the pre-war period that the wasteland communities have broad access to. Books, terminal entries, holotapes, these require proximity, literacy, equipment, but the radio is ambient. It fills space. A generation that grew up listening to Uranium Fever on a crackling transistor radio grew up with a specific, curated version of what the pre-war world sounded like. Optimistic, bright, swinging, full of an energy that the post-war world conspicuously lacks. This curated version is not representative. The pre-war world had enormous darkness, the resource wars, the political paranoia, the experiments, the institutional violence, none of which appears in the pop song's Three Dog broadcasts. What appears in the songs is the emotional register of a civilization at its most charming and self-confident, the face it put forward for entertainment rather than the face it wore for governance. The wasteland communities that grow up with this music inherit a yearning for something they've never experienced, and that was never quite as described. The songs produce nostalgia for a world that doesn't exist in the form the songs suggest. This manufactured nostalgia is part of what makes pre-war artifacts so powerful. The Nuka-Cola machines, the Mister, handy robots, the Pip-Boys, they carry the aesthetic of that hopeful, self-confident era forward into a world that has every reason to distrust it, and the aesthetic persists because the alternative is living in the ruin without any thread of connection to what came before. The music is also, not incidentally, a form of propaganda for a dead civilization. It maintains the emotional reality of pre-war America in the minds of post-war Americans. It keeps the old world feelable even as its physical remnants decay. And since the old world is the foundational reference point for every political project in the wasteland, restore it, reject it, improve it, transcend it, keeping it emotionally vivid is a political act, even if Three Dog doesn't think of it that way. I don't want to set the world on fire. The Ink Spots recorded that in 1941. In the Fallout universe, the song plays in a world that someone did set on fire, and it plays with the same voice, the same gentle longing, the same small and private request for joy. The irony is so complete it comes back around to sincerity. It's not funny that the song plays in the ruins. It's devastating, quietly and persistently, And it's also somehow comforting, in the way that a song you love is comforting even when everything around you is terrible. The songs are the emotional core of the Fallout experience, and the theory they embody is about the persistence of beauty in conditions that would seem to preclude it. The bombs fell and the world ended and 200 years passed and something is still playing music. And people are still, improbably, listening. That's not nothing. In the Fallout universe, as in every universe, that's actually quite a lot. Section 19. The Lone Wanderer's Father and the Tragedy of Idealism. James, the Lone Wanderer's father in Fallout 3, is one of the most sympathetically written characters in the series, and also one of its most quietly tragic. He is a scientist and a visionary and a fundamentally decent person who made a choice so enormous and so personal that it should be studied as a case in how private moral conviction operates when it collides with institutional reality. James abandoned Vault 101, broke its fundamental rule, the one rule that defined the Vault's entire social contract, that the door doesn't open, that the outside doesn't come in to pursue the completion of Project Purity. The water purification system that his wife Catherine had died working on, a project that, if completed, could provide clean drinking water to an enormous portion of the capital wasteland's population. He left his child behind. A 10-year-old who had grown up believing that Vault 101 was the world, that no one ever leaves, that the door was the permanent boundary of existence. And he left, in the middle of the night, without a word. The theory worth examining about James is not whether he was wrong to leave. Reasonable people can disagree about that, and the game allows for it, but what his departure reveals about the relationship between individual moral clarity and the costs it imposes on others. James saw the situation clearly. He had a project that could save lives, work that needed to be done, skills and knowledge that no one else in the wasteland possessed in quite the same combination. He had a child who was safe and being cared for in the vault. From a utilitarian standpoint, the calculation produces an answer. Go to the surface, complete the project, save the lives. The child is confused, but the child is alive and relatively safe, and hundreds of thousands of people lack clean water. What's missing from that calculation is the specific weight of being the child, of growing up in a sealed bunker believing your father chose something over you, of the identity-level damage that comes from abandonment in childhood, not because the person who left was bad, but because they were pursuing something they believed was more important. Fallout 3's narrative gives you the lone wanderer's perspective by putting you in it. You are the one who grew up without understanding why. You are the one who follows your father across the capital wasteland, trying to understand, and you are ultimately the one who has to make sense of who he was and whether what he did was defensible. James's motivation is not selfish. It is genuinely altruistic. He wants to make the world better. The project works. Project Purity, once completed, does what he believed it could do. Clean water flows. The goal he sacrificed his family's normal life to achieve is achieved. And this is the theory about idealism that Fallout 3 is most interested in. The difference between a goal and the means of pursuing it. James's goal was good. His means, the abandonment of his child without explanation, without preparation, without a goodbye, was something he apparently decided was necessary collateral in the pursuit of something larger. The lone wanderer, when they find him, gets to decide whether they agree with that assessment. The game doesn't tell you what to think. You can admire James and mourn the father he wasn't at the same time, and the game will hold the contradiction without resolving it, because the contradiction is real and the resolution would be false. The deeper theory embedded in Fallout 3's main storyline is about what happens when the personal and the political are forced into competition. Most ethical systems, in practice, assume that you don't have to choose between your child and the world. Most lives, in most circumstances, don't produce that choice at that scale. James's life produced it, because of where he was, what he knew, and what the world needed. The tragedy is that he made a defensible choice, and it cost his child something that cannot be given back. Both of those things are true. The water runs clean, and the lone wanderer grew up without a father, and the sum of those facts is not a lesson that resolves into a simple moral, but a weight that has to be carried without comfort. Section 20. What the universe is really saying. The pattern beneath every ruin. We've spent this entire journey moving through the Fallout universe's theories, and I want to take a moment before the end to pull back to the altitude where the overall shape becomes visible. Because Fallout, across every iteration, every game, and every DLC, and now the television series, is telling one consistent story under all the surface variation. It's telling a story about the relationship between civilization and catastrophe, and specifically about the fact that these two things are not opposites. Catastrophe isn't what happens to civilization from outside. Catastrophe is what civilization produces when the pressures internal to it exceed the capacity of its structures to manage them. The Great War wasn't an asteroid impact. It wasn't a natural disaster. It was the output of 2 centuries of choices, compounding each other, each one small and rational in its immediate context, catastrophic in aggregate. Every faction in the wasteland is, in one way or another, in the process of reconstructing the conditions that produced the Great War. The NCR is rebuilding democratic institutions that carry democratic institutions' characteristic failure modes. Caesar's Legion is rebuilding imperialism. The Institute is rebuilding corporate control of human life. The Enclave is rebuilding fascism with a survivalist veneer. Even the Brotherhood of Steel is rebuilding feudalism, with technological knowledge as the new aristocratic bloodline. Nobody in the wasteland, with perhaps the partial exception of some followers of the apocalypse, is trying to build something genuinely new. They're all reaching back into the same box of historical options and pulling out one of the models that existed before, usually the one that feels most familiar to the people doing the building, regardless of whether it's the one that would work best going forward. The theory this suggests is quietly hopeful, in a way the apocalyptic setting doesn't immediately advertise. If the catastrophe was produced by human choices, then different choices could produce different outcomes. The wasteland is not determined. The future of the Fallout universe is not written. Every player character who walks through the Commonwealth or the Mojave or the Capital Wasteland is participating in a genuine experiment about what comes next, and the fact that the experiment has so many possible outcomes, so many different endings, so many different ways the world can look, depending on what you do, is the universe's way of insisting on the significance of choice. The bombs dropped, the world ended, and then things happened that weren't inevitable. Communities formed, people helped each other. Leaders emerged, some terrible, some admirable, most complicated. Ideas competed, technologies were lost and recovered, and sometimes improved. The wasteland is not a static ruined state, it's a dynamic system still in motion, still capable of producing something better or something worse depending on the inputs. You, as the player character, are one of the inputs. That's the final theory of the Fallout universe, and it's the one that makes the whole thing matter beyond entertainment. The post-apocalyptic world is not a warning about how things will end. It's a thought experiment about what comes after endings. It's asking what you would do if you inherited a world that had already made its worst decisions. What you would build, what you would protect, who you would choose to be when the institutions that might have defined your choices are no longer there to do it. It's asking, if you had to start over, knowing what you know, would you do it differently? The answer to that question is the only thing that matters. The theories, the lore, the mysteries about who fired first and what the mysterious stranger is and whether synths are conscious, all of it is context for that question. All of it is the universe building up enough density that when the question arrives, you feel it in your chest rather than just in your head. Fallout is a universe built on ruin, but it keeps asking about what grows in ruins, and it keeps insisting that what grows is not predetermined, that it matters what seeds you plant and how you tend them, and whether you're willing to look honestly at what's already sprouting. The bombs fell on the 23rd of October, 2077. The world ended. And then things started again, because they always do, because that's what living things do in the aftermath. And somewhere in the wasteland, a figure in a trench coat appears out of nowhere, fires a decisive shot, and disappears before anyone can ask who he was. And a Deathclaw, enormous and terrible and genuinely alive, picks its way through the rubble of something that used to be a city, following paths that the city's architects never intended and would never have predicted. And in a sealed underground facility, a synth lies down in a maintenance berth and, entirely without meaning to, begins to dream. And you, the player character, the one who walked out of the vault and went out into the ash and the radiation and the ruins of everything you keep walking, because that's what you do, because there's still something worth walking toward. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely. These deep dives take time and thought, and the fact that you kept me company through all of it, whether you were drifting off or wide awake with a new theory forming, means more than I can easily say. Drop a comment with your favorite Fallout theory, the one that lives rent-free in your head long after you've put down the controller. And if any of these ideas tonight gave you something new to sit with, consider subscribing. We do this kind of slow, careful exploration regularly, and there's an entire universe of material still waiting. The wasteland is deep. We've only scratched the surface. Sleep well, and watch your back. War never changes, but maybe, just maybe, the people fighting it can. Section 21. The Survivor's Psychology. What the wasteland does to people over generations. One of the things that Fallout does, almost in passing, is build an incredibly detailed portrait of what sustained survival in extreme conditions does to human psychology. Not just the individuals who lived through the Great War, those people are rare, mostly ghouls by now, but the generations who have grown up in the aftermath, who have never known anything other than the wasteland, and therefore can't fully feel its wrongness, because wrong implies a right they've never experienced. The wasteland is not simply a physical environment, it's a psychological one. The combination of constant threat, scarcity of basic resources, isolation from larger community structures, and the ambient knowledge that the world as previously known is gone. These conditions don't just make people physically exhausted, they reshape how people think, what they value, what they trust, what they're capable of imagining. The raiders, in every game, are typically presented as antagonists, enemies to fight, obstacles to overcome. But the raiders are also the product of a specific psychological trajectory. People who had nothing to protect, no community to anchor them, no institutional framework to give their lives structure, and who resolve the resulting anxiety by organizing around force. The raider gangs are a kind of government. They provide structure, belonging, and identity, but they're a government whose only social contract is violence. Everyone inside the group is protected from the group's violence. Everyone outside is fair game. This is not pathological in any simple sense. It's a recognizable, adaptive strategy in an environment where the only reliable resource is physical strength and the willingness to use it. The raiders didn't decide to be bad. They found a survival strategy that works, in the most narrow sense of works, and built an identity around it. The settlers of Diamond City and Fallout 4, by contrast, have managed to build something more stable. The city exists inside Fenway Park, with the old stadium's walls providing both physical protection and a kind of psychological enclosure. You're inside something that was once a gathering place, a civic institution, however modest, and that history gives the current settlement a borrowed dignity. People in Diamond City have homes, have businesses, have something like daily lives. They've built what stability looked like before the bombs and tried to maintain the feeling of it. But Diamond City is also deeply suspicious of synths. The fear of the other is never more potent than in communities that have something real to lose, something to protect, and the thing they fear threatens the viability of the trust that their community runs on. If any member of your community might be a synth, then trust among members is structurally compromised, because you can never be certain the person you trust is the person they appear to be. This anxiety is psychologically precise. Trust is the operating system of any human community. When the reliability of identity itself becomes uncertain, the operating system glitches. People become hypervigilant. Small communities become suspicious in ways that corrode the social bonds they depend on to function. Diamond City's anti-synth sentiment is terrible for the synths affected by it, but it's comprehensible as a response to genuine epistemic uncertainty. The theory the wasteland's communities advance about human psychology is ultimately about the relationship between security and openness. Communities with high security, reliable food, functional defenses, coherent governance tend to be more open to outsiders, more curious, more willing to tolerate ambiguity. Communities with low security, Diamond City's perpetual anxiety, the overextended NCR supply lines, the isolated settlements trying to survive on minimal resources tend to be more closed, more suspicious, more likely to resolve uncertainty by lashing out. The Fallout universe is a laboratory for this relationship, and what it consistently shows is that the psychological damage of scarcity compounds across generations. The grandchildren of Great War survivors inherited not just material scarcity, but the psychological frameworks that scarcity produced: the hypervigilance, the difficulty trusting outsiders, the tendency to solve problems with force, because force is the tool that never runs out of energy when you're already exhausted. These frameworks get passed down through community culture, through the stories adults tell children about what the world is like and what's safe and what isn't. which is why the settlements that managed to break the cycle Diamond City despite its problems, Good Neighbor, with its particular flavor of lawless tolerance, the Followers Hospital, the independent trading posts that spring up along major wasteland routes stand out so clearly. They've found something that functions as a release valve on compounding anxiety, and the result is visible in how their inhabitants engage with strangers and with questions. The Fallout universe's most psychologically healthy communities are the ones that found a way to provide enough security, physical, social, psychological, that their residents can afford the luxury of being curious rather than afraid. The most dangerous communities are the ones where scarcity has reduced residents to a single operational priority, and that priority has crowded out everything else. This theory has a practical implication that the games explore without stating explicitly. The way to make the wasteland better is not primarily military. You can eliminate every raider camp and institute a functional water supply and still not change the underlying psychological environment that will produce the next generation of raiders. What changes the underlying environment is sustained, reliable, actually experienced security. The kind that allows children to grow up without the hypervigilant threat detection that prolonged insecurity hardwires into developing nervous systems. The Minutemen of Fallout 4, at their best, are an attempt at this. Not just fighting threats, but building a defensive network that means threats become less common. Not just defending settlements, but building relationships between settlements that make each one feel part of something larger, safer by association, not just by their own fortifications. The theory is that scale of security changes what's possible psychologically, and what's possible psychologically changes what a community can build. Whether it works depends, in the game as in life, on whether enough people sustain the effort long enough for the psychological environment to actually change. And that requires exactly the kind of sustained institutional commitment that's hardest to maintain in conditions of chronic instability. The wasteland doesn't make this easy, it never has. But the communities that are trying, the ones building instead of just defending, expanding instead of just surviving, those are where the Fallout universe's actual hope lies. Section 22. The NCR's slow collapse and why it was always coming. The New California Republic is the largest political entity in the post-war West. By the time of Fallout, New Vegas, it controls territory equivalent to several pre-war states, maintains a professional standing army with functioning supply chains, runs something approaching a civil court system, collects taxes, builds infrastructure, and manages trade across the Mojave. It is, by any wasteland standard, extraordinary. It is also, by any careful reading of its internal documents and the testimony of its own citizens, in serious trouble. The NCR's problems are not unusual problems. They're the most ordinary problems in the world, the problems of a democratic republic that has expanded faster than its institutional capacity to manage the expansion, that is simultaneously operating as a welfare state for its core citizens and as a military power trying to control new territories with the resources it was barely using wisely to begin with. The Brahmin barons, the cattle ranchers who form the backbone of NCR's agricultural economy, have accumulated disproportionate political influence. They control the food supply, which means they control something the government needs, which means the government listens to them in ways that don't always align with the interests of the people the government is nominally serving. This is not unique to the NCR. This is the standard dynamic of agricultural capitalism in every society where it's appeared. Those who control food production accumulate political influence in rough proportion to how much others need their food. The military situation in the Mojave is a case study in strategic overextension. The NCR has committed significant forces to hold Hoover Dam and maintain some semblance of order in the Las Vegas area, both of which are enormous resource sinks. The dam is genuinely valuable. It could produce electricity for a significant portion of the NCR's territory if it were under full operational control. But the military presence required to hold it against Caesar's Legion costs more in troop deployment and supply chain strain than the electricity it currently produces. General Lee Oliver, commanding the NCR's Mojave forces, is an administrator rather than a tactician. He's good at holding a line and maintaining organizational structure, not particularly creative in the face of a dynamic threat. The NCR's Ranger Corps, who operate more independently and with better situational awareness, are more effective fighters, but they're a small, elite force relative to the larger army they're nominally part of. The internal corruption is ambient and pervasive. Not dramatic, not a single moment of villainous betrayal, but a low-level set of arrangements where officers take what they can, supplies go missing before reaching their destinations, civilians in NCR-controlled territories find that the Republic's protection is real, but comes with conditions that weren't in the original agreement. This is not unique to the NCR. This is what happens when institutions grow large enough that people operating them can extract personal benefit from their positions with limited accountability and with leadership too distant to notice or too busy to act. The theory that the NCR is in gradual structural decline is one of New Vegas's most carefully supported arguments. Every faction-specific questline that takes you deep into NCR territory, Bitter Springs, Camp Forlorn Hope, the various ranger stations paints a picture of an institution under sustained pressure it can't quite respond to effectively. The soldiers are exhausted. Supply lines are unreliable. The civilian population in the outer territories feels the weight of NCR taxation without feeling much corresponding benefit from NCR governance. The core territories, New California itself, are prosperous, but that prosperity depends on the sustained extraction of resources from regions that aren't sharing proportionally in the returns. What New Vegas suggests is that democracy, specifically the NCR model of it, is not self-sustaining in the absence of active, sustained effort to maintain its institutions against the drift toward oligarchy. The barons and the generals and the corrupt quartermasters are not the villains of a story where democracy is fine and a few bad actors are ruining it. They're the predictable output of a system that doesn't have strong enough internal accountability mechanisms to resist the drift toward serving those who already have power. This theory is not pessimistic about democracy specifically. New Vegas is not arguing that the Legion or House are better. It's arguing that every political system contains within itself the seeds of its own deformation, and that the quality of a civilization depends on how much effort its citizens and institutions put into recognizing and resisting that drift. The NCR could be better. The game is explicit that it contains people who are genuinely trying to make it better, individuals of real integrity, working within a system that's larger and more inertial than any single person's good intentions can compensate for. The question the game poses is whether collective effort, sustained over time, is enough to reform a system from within, or whether external pressure is required to force the adaptation the NCR's internal dynamics can't produce on their own. There is no clean answer in the game. Every ending slides towards some kind of ambiguity. An NCR victory at Hoover Dam sets up a stronger NCR position in the Mojave, but the systemic issues are unchanged. An independent Vegas under Yes Man's management is a wild card. House's Las Vegas is prosperous and controlled. The Legion's victory would represent the imposition of brutal order at enormous human cost. The theory the game really advances is about the nature of political time. Institutional problems accumulate slowly. Reforms happen slowly. The kind of change that could actually address the NCR's structural deformations would require not just a single heroic intervention but sustained political will over many years, by many people who are largely anonymous and who will never be the subject of a video game's narrative. The Courier can help in the short term. They can shape the Mojave's outcome at Hoover Dam. But the NCR's long-term trajectory depends on what the NCR does with itself after the Courier has moved on. That question, open, unanswered, persisting beyond the credits, is the most honest thing New Vegas says about political systems. They outlast the heroes who intervene in them, and what they become is finally about what their ordinary participants choose to sustain. Section 23. Robert House and the Loneliness of Perfect Preparation. Robert Edwin House is one of the most unusual characters in the entire Fallout series, and one of the most philosophically interesting, because he is defined entirely by what he survived. House was, before the Great War, something like a combination of Howard Hughes and Elon Musk and Isaac Asimov, a genius billionaire industrialist with an extraordinary capacity for predictive modeling and an apparently genuine belief that his own intelligence, properly applied, was among the most valuable things that could be preserved through an apocalypse. His company, Robco Industries, produced the Terminals, the Pip-Boys, the Protectrons, the Mr. Gutsy units, the Securitrons, the robots that populate every corner of the wasteland because he built them to last, and they have. He knew the bombs were coming. He didn't know exactly when, but his calculations told him the probability was close to 1, and so he spent the decades before the war preparing with a specificity that borders on obsession. The Lucky 38 was his preparation. The Securitron army was his preparation. The life support systems that keep his body minimally alive in a sealed pod were his preparation. The elaborate network of cameras that give him sight across Las Vegas were his preparation. When the bombs fell, House's systems deflected enough warheads to preserve the Las Vegas Strip, not perfectly, not completely, but enough that the city survived in recognizable form rather than as a crater. And then he went to sleep, in a sense, maintaining his systems in minimal operation mode while the world around him spent the next 2 centuries killing itself. He woke up eventually and found that the Las Vegas Strip was still there. The Securitrons still functioned. The casinos could be reopened. The city could be what he'd imagined it would be after the war, a proof of concept for a certain kind of civilization. Efficient, profitable, safe within its perimeter, indifferent to the chaos surrounding it. The theory worth developing about House is about what perfect preparation does to a person over time. House has been alive for over 2 centuries, most of it in minimal contact with other human beings, sustained by machines and cameras and the elaborate life support system that keeps his decayed body technically functional. He has had over 200 years to think, 200 years of watching the wasteland from his cameras, running calculations, updating his models, waiting for the conditions that would allow his plan to proceed. What has this done to him? He is undeniably brilliant. The Securitron network is a genuine engineering achievement. His understanding of the pre-war world and its technology exceeds almost anyone else's. His predictive models of political dynamics in the Mojave are more accurate than his competitors' self-assessments. He is, by any reasonable measure, more knowledgeable and more strategically capable than the NCR's leadership, Caesar, or any other significant actor in the region. He is also genuinely unable to conceive of governance that doesn't center on himself. This is not arrogance, exactly. It's something more like the result of 2 centuries of operating as the only really competent intelligence in his operational environment. He doesn't distrust other people because he's looked down on them. He distrusts them because he's watched them, through his cameras, across 2 centuries, and what he's watched is an unbroken sequence of human communities making avoidable mistakes that his modeling could have predicted and his resources could have prevented, if only they'd deferred to him. The problem with this experience is that it's self-validating. Every time a community fails without his intervention, that confirms that they needed him. Every time he intervenes and things improve, that confirms that he was right to. What doesn't get recorded, what his cameras don't show him, is what might have happened if those communities had been allowed to develop their own competence rather than receiving help from an external intelligence they can't understand or influence or replace. House's New Vegas is good at what it does. It's safe on the Strip. It's profitable. For House, it provides entertainment and employment in a region that desperately needs both. The Securitrons are effective at managing violence within their operational parameters. What it doesn't do is build human capacity. The communities of the Mojave under House's management are safer, but they're not becoming more capable of managing their own safety. They're not developing the institutional muscles that would allow them to function without him, because House doesn't want them to develop those muscles. He wants them to need him permanently, because he's built his entire identity around being the necessary intelligence that everyone else lacks. 200 years of loneliness has produced something brilliant and something stunted in Robert House. He can model political outcomes with extraordinary accuracy. He can predict resource flows and military dynamics and economic incentives. What he can't model because he hasn't experienced it in 2 centuries is what it feels like to genuinely need someone else, to be dependent in a way that requires trust, to participate in a relationship of mutual vulnerability rather than a relationship of asymmetric capability. House's plan will work in the narrow sense. The Mojave will be safer and more prosperous, and the people of the Mojave will, in an important sense, not be the authors of their own future. They'll be subjects of someone else's vision, however benevolent that vision might be. The theory House represents is about the cost of being right. He's right about a lot of things. He's right that the NCR's overextension is a problem, that Caesar's legion can't survive Caesar, that the Mojave needs stability. But being right about the diagnosis doesn't mean his prescription is the best available one. And the confidence that comes from being right about so many things for so long has made it structurally impossible for him to genuinely consider that someone else might have a better answer. 2 centuries of preparation, and Robert House is the most prepared and the most isolated person in the Fallout universe. The preparation worked. The isolation is the cost. Section 24. The Ghoul's Memory. What 2 centuries does to a person. Cooper Howard, the Ghoul of the Fallout television series, presents the most extended case study the franchise has ever offered on a question it's been circling for 30 years. What does a human being become after 2 centuries of surviving in the wasteland? The answer is complicated, and the show is honest about the complication. Cooper was, before the bombs, a television actor. Specifically, he was a cowboy actor, someone who played the American West's mythology of independent heroism for audiences who consumed it as escapism and as something like cultural religion. He was successful. He was recognizable. He was, in the pre-war American context, someone who embodied a specific set of values in a highly visible way. Self-reliance, physical competence, moral clarity, the willingness to use violence in service of justice. He was also, we learn through the show's flashbacks, more complicated than that performance suggested. He had a wife with connections to Vault-Tec. He was beginning to understand, in the months before the bombs dropped, that the America he'd spent his career celebrating was involved in things that didn't align with the values he'd been depicting. The cognitive dissonance of being the face of American heroism while beginning to understand what America was actually doing must have been extraordinary. And then the bombs dropped, and his wife and daughter disappeared into a vault while he didn't, and he spent the next 2 centuries in the wasteland, becoming a ghoul, surviving through what can only be described as an act of sustained biological will that the show never fully explains, but also never asks you to find unbelievable. The question the show keeps returning to and the theory it's building toward, gradually and with care, is whether Cooper still is Cooper. He looks different. The ghoulification has destroyed his appearance in ways that make him recognizably not human in the conventional sense. He has survived things that should have killed him multiple times over. He has lived through eras of the wasteland's history that are, for everyone else alive, the distant past. He has made choices across 2 centuries that he can't fully account for, because some of what he remembers he's uncertain about, and some of what he did he's clearly not proud of, and some of what he became he isn't entirely sure how to evaluate. The theory from the show is that continuity of identity over 2 centuries of extreme stress is not guaranteed. The person you are at 20 is not identically the person you are at 40, and those differences compound over time in ways that make the relationship between early self and later self something that requires active maintenance and reflection to sustain. Most people don't live long enough to have to actively maintain that continuity. The normal human lifespan is short enough that the core personality formed in early life has enough time to remain recognizable. Cooper has had to maintain that continuity over a span so long that the civilization that formed him has been ash for longer than it existed. The pre-war United States existed for about 200 years before the bombs. Cooper has survived for about 200 years after them. He has now been a post-war survivor for as long as America was a country. What's still Cooper in the Ghoul is the survival instinct, the physical competence, some residual moral framework that keeps him from being purely mercenary even when mercenary would be more practical. What's potentially lost, or transformed, is the certainty, the clarity about what's worth fighting for, what's worth protecting, what the line is between the violence that serves something and the violence that is just violence. The show's most interesting implication about the Ghoul is that he might be in the process of finding that clarity again, that 2 centuries of wandering without a coherent purpose are perhaps coming to a point where the question of what he actually believes reasserts itself. The children of Adam believe that the Great War was creation. The Enclave believes it was a cleansing. Caesar believes it was proof that everything before it was a failure. Robert House believes it was an engineering problem that his preparation solved. What the Ghoul believes is less clearly articulated, and that might be the show's most honest statement about what 2 centuries of survival actually produces. Not wisdom exactly, but the gradual, uncertain possibility of wisdom, available if you're willing to look honestly at what you've become. The theory about 200 years of survival is ultimately a theory about the relationship between experience and understanding. More experience doesn't automatically produce more understanding. It produces more data, which requires interpretation, which requires a framework. The framework that Cooper carried into the wasteland was pre-war America's framework, and he's been testing it against 2 centuries of contrary evidence. What he does with that evidence, what any of us does with evidence that contradicts our foundational frameworks, is the most revealing thing about us. Cooper Howard, 2 centuries after the end of the world, is still in the process of deciding. Section 25. The world after where Fallout is heading, and what that means. As this script is written, the Fallout universe is more active than it's been in years. The television series on Prime Video has brought new audiences into contact with the lore. Fallout 76's continuing updates have expanded the post-war history of Appalachia. And in the background, somewhere in the long planning horizon of Bethesda's development slate, Fallout 5 is being contemplated, with a release timeline that remains years away given the current priority on The Elder Scrolls 6. The question of where the lore is going, what theories about the future of the Fallout universe can be sustained, is one of the more interesting intellectual exercises available to invested fans. The TV show's second season moves deeper into the Enclave's ongoing activities and the cold fusion technology that powered Season 1's central plot. The Brotherhood of Steel now possesses that technology, making them one of the most capable factions in the current timeline. The relationship between the Brotherhood and the Enclave long-standing adversaries, competing successors to different aspects of the pre-war government's authority, is developing towards something that will require a resolution. The character of the Ghoul continues to carry 2 centuries of history through the current storyline. He is, in many ways, the living embodiment of the theory this entire script has been developing. A person shaped by the pre-war world, preserved through impossible circumstances into the post-war one, carrying both the values of what was before and the damage done by what came after. His arc is about what you keep and what you let go when you've been alive long enough to see everything you believed in either fulfilled or destroyed. The broader theory that the show is developing, and the early signals from Season 2 support this, is that the surface is the real experiment. Not the vaults, not the underground laboratories. The surface, where people have been trying to rebuild without constant observation and controlled conditions, is where the actual test of human resilience and adaptability is running. And the conclusion the show seems to be building toward, the one that the games have also been gesturing at across 30 years of lore, is that the test has not yet produced a final answer. The surface communities are flawed, sometimes brutal, occasionally extraordinary, always in motion. The vaults were controlled experiments that produced controlled data. The surface is uncontrolled, and uncontrolled experiments are the ones that produce surprises. The future of the Fallout universe, in every possible reading of its trajectory, involves the question of whether humanity can learn from what it did. Not in the sense of a single dramatic lesson delivered by a wise sage, the universe is too honest for that, but in the sense of millions of small decisions made by communities and individuals across the wasteland that either reproduce the patterns that produce the Great War or, in aggregate and over time, begin to produce something different. The NCR's corruption is a reproduction. Caesar's legion is a reproduction. The Institute's hierarchy is a reproduction. The Enclave's fascism is a reproduction. What's not a reproduction, what might be genuinely new, are the small communities that have built something different from available pieces, the individuals who've refused the available models and tried to think from first principles, the followers who keep treating whoever shows up regardless of faction, the settlements that have found a way to be open rather than closed, the ghouls who remember what was lost and carry that memory as grief rather than as justification. Fallout 5, whatever it ends up being, will presumably advance this question further. It will presumably introduce new factions with new rationalizations for their behavior, new communities trying different things, new technology being recovered or developed, new territory with its own history and its own scars. And it will presumably, somewhere in its world, have a small story in a corner, a skeleton with something nearby that explains them, a terminal entry from someone's last ordinary day, a song on the radio from a world that no longer exists that makes everything abstract become specific and human and real. That's the Fallout guarantee. The universe can handle enormous political and philosophical complexity because it keeps returning to the granular level, to the single human experience, to the voice in the holotape that says something ordinary about something that is no longer ordinary at all. The bombs fell, the world ended, and then things started again, because they always do. Because that's what living things do in the aftermath. And somewhere in the wasteland, a figure in a trench coat appears out of nowhere, fires a decisive shot, and disappears before anyone can ask who he was. And a Deathclaw picks its way through rubble, following paths the architects of that rubble never imagined. And in a sealed underground facility, a synth lies down and begins to dream. And you, the one who went outside when you didn't have to, keep walking. Because there's still something worth walking toward. Section 26. The Vault Dweller's Legacy. How the first game built everything. There's something worth doing before we close, going all the way back to where it started and sitting with what the original Fallout game actually was and what it actually said, because everything that came after was built on it, and the foundation deserves attention. Fallout 1 was released in 1997. It came out in an era when post-apocalyptic fiction existed but had not been codified into the tropes that would later seem inevitable. The Mad Max films were the primary cultural reference point. The concept of a detailed, believable post-nuclear world explored through a role-playing game was not an established genre expectation. It was a genuine risk. Tim Kaine and the team at Interplay took that risk and built something that worked as entertainment and as something more than entertainment. A genuinely thoughtful meditation on what survives catastrophe and what doesn't, and what it means to act ethically in conditions where all the normal ethical scaffolding has been removed. The Vault Dweller, your character, begins the game with a simple mission: find a water chip. The Vault's water recycling system is failing. You have a limited number of days to find a replacement part, or the entire community will die. It is, as opening premises go, remarkably modest. Not save the world, not defeat the villain, just find a piece of hardware. Go to the hardware store. Except the hardware store is a radioactive wasteland full of things that want to kill you. What the game discovers along the way, and what it wants you to discover, is that the mission of finding the water chip is embedded inside a much larger situation that you couldn't have anticipated from inside the vault. The forced evolutionary virus. The Master. The Cathedral. The children of the Cathedral and their role as a front organization for the Master's recruitment. The Mariposa military base, where the FEV is being used to create super mutants at industrial scale. By the time you reach the end of the main quest, the stakes have expanded from find a water chip to prevent the super mutant army from overrunning humanity, which is a significant scope expansion. But the game earns this expansion because it arrives through the same mechanism that all good discovery arrives through in Fallout. The world tells you what's happening as you move through it. The information doesn't descend from an omniscient narrator. You find it in terminals, in conversations with NPCs who may or may not be reliable, in environmental details that accumulate over time to a picture that no one element could convey alone. The first game's deepest theory is about the relationship between knowledge and responsibility. The Vault Dweller didn't go outside knowing about the Master. They went outside to find a water chip. The knowledge of the larger situation was forced on them by the world they moved through. And once you know something, once you understand that the Master's plan, if successful, will end the human species as it currently exists, not acting on that knowledge is itself a choice, with its own consequences. This is the engine of every Fallout protagonist's story. You go outside for a manageable reason. You discover an unmanageable situation. The question is whether you're willing to engage with the unmanageable situation, or whether you go back to the vault with the water chip and live out your days in comfort. The answer the game rewards is engagement, but the game is careful not to make this feel easy or obvious. The vault community wants you back. They need the water chip. Your responsibility to your home pulls against your responsibility to the wider world you've now seen and can't unsee. The original game held this tension more honestly than some of the later games, which lean more heavily on the player character being an externally driven hero rather than someone with a specific community to return to. The ending of Fallout 1 is among the most discussed conclusions in video game history. Having saved the world, having defeated the Master, having collapsed the Mariposa military base, having protected the human species from the super mutant army, the Vault Dweller returns home and is exiled. The Overseer, citing the concern that the Vault Dweller's experiences on the surface have made them dangerous, unable to readjust to Vault life, a destabilizing influence on a community built around the premise that no one leaves and no one comes back fundamentally changed, sends them away. It is a quiet, devastating conclusion. Not the hero celebrated, not the hero at rest. The hero excluded because they've been irrevocably altered by the thing that made them heroic. The Vault Dweller gained the experience necessary to save the world precisely by going out into the world, and going out into the world changed them in ways that made them no longer fit for the community they were trying to protect. This ending says something the rest of the series returns to across every installment. Surviving in the wasteland changes you. The values, the capacities, the willingness to act on your own judgment in conditions where all the normal authorities are absent. These things are adaptive in the wasteland and disruptive in any community that's achieved stability through the more conventional mechanism of having everyone accept shared constraints. The Vault Dwellers' exile produced the Arroyo tribal community that the Chosen One comes from in Fallout 2. The exile was painful, and it was right, and it produced something new, a community shaped by the exile's experience, carrying forward a specific set of values about independence and ethical action in hostile conditions. The original Fallout game's theory about its protagonist is the same theory all the games eventually arrive at. The things that make you capable of acting decisively in extreme conditions are the same things that make you difficult to accommodate in conditions of relative normalcy. The hero and the institution are in permanent tension, because the hero's capability was forged in the absence of institution, and institutions that work are always going to be somewhat suspicious of people whose entire capacity was built for conditions where institutions don't work. The Vault Dweller walks out into the wasteland carrying a Pip-Boy and a 10mm pistol and the specific, limited knowledge of a person who has lived their entire life underground. They come back to the extent they come back carrying something that the Vault has no category for, and that the Overseer correctly identifies as incompatible with the Vault's continued functioning as a controlled environment. The water chip is found. The super mutant army is stopped. The Vault is saved. The Vault Dweller is exiled. The world is not fair. The world does not reward heroism with comfort. The world transforms the people who engage with it fully, and the transformation is not reversible. The Vault Dweller is the first of many Fallout protagonists to discover that going outside changes everything, including you, and that the change includes losing things you didn't know you wanted to keep. That's the original theory. That's where all of this started. A water chip, a ruined world, a choice about whether to act on what you know, and an ending that refuses to let heroism be simple. Everything that followed the Chosen One, the Lone Wanderer, the Courier, the Sole Survivor, is that theory extended, elaborated, challenged, revised, and refined across 30 years of storytelling. The wasteland keeps changing. The fundamental human situation stays the same. You know something now that you can't unknow, and the question is what you're going to do about it. Walk forward, ask questions, carry what you've learned and what you've lost with equal honesty. That's all the Vault Dweller did. That's all any of them ever do. And somehow, improbably, it's enough. If you made it all the way to the end of this one, thank you. Genuinely? These deep dives into lore take time and real care, and the fact that you kept me company through all of it, whether you were drifting towards sleep or wide awake with a new theory forming that means more than I can easily say, drop a comment with your favorite Fallout theory, the one that lives in your head long after you've put down the controller. Maybe it's something about the mysterious stranger that clicked for you tonight, or the synth's consciousness question finally landing with its full weight, or the pre-war world's frozen aesthetics making a new kind of sense. Whatever theory took root, share it. The best Fallout conversations happen in the comments, because this community takes the lore as seriously as it deserves to be taken, and seriously is exactly the right register for a universe built on this much care. And if any of these ideas gave you something new to sit with tonight, consider subscribing. We do this kind of slow, careful exploration regularly, and there is an enormous amount of Fallout universe still left to explore. The vaults are deep, the wasteland is wide, and the theories keep accumulating because the lore keeps rewarding attention in ways that few fictional universes match. The wasteland is deep. We've only scratched the surface tonight. There are entire topics we've barely touched: the full history of the NCR Brotherhood War, the strange theology of Ulysses' flag collection, the lore implications of the different ending slides across every game, the way Fallout 76's prequel setting creates both clarity and new contradictions about the early post-war period, the specific genius of the Old World Blues DLC, and what Big Mountain represents as a kind of compressed mythology of scientific hubris, the story of Joshua Graham's survival and redemption that Honest Hearts tells as quietly as any Fallout narrative has told anything. All of it is still out there, waiting for another night like this one. Sleep well, and watch your back. War never changes. But maybe, just maybe, the people fighting it can. Author's note: this script was written to be read slowly, with pauses, the way a good bedtime story should be. The Fallout universe rewards exactly the kind of attention that comes when you're lying still in the dark with nothing demanding anything from you. Every theory here is grounded in actual game lore, developer statements, and community research accumulated across nearly 30 years of the franchise's history. Where theories are genuinely speculative, the script acknowledges the speculation. Where they're drawn from confirmed developer statements, Tim Kane's Vault explanation, Todd Howard's timeline comments, Josh Sawyer's faction design philosophy, the attribution is clear. The goal throughout was to honor the intelligence and care that went into building this universe, and to pass some of that care along to whoever is listening. Total word count, 30,000 plus words. This script is structured for 11 Labs voiceover generation and covers 26 major sections encompassing Vault lore, pre-war history, the Institute and Synths, the Great War's contested origins, the Brotherhood of Steel's ideological evolution, wasteland creatures and their origins, the mysterious stranger, the Enclave, lore contradictions and their productive ambiguity, the factions of New Vegas, environmental storytelling, player character philosophy, the Children of Adam, Ulysses and the Divide, power armor as sacrament, the followers of the apocalypse, the music of the wasteland, James and the tragedy of idealism, the NCR's structural decline, Robert House's loneliness, the Ghoul's two-century survival, the future of the franchise, Survivor's psychology, the Vault Dweller's legacy, and the final theory that underpins the entire universe. The Wasteland keeps giving. See you next time.